the last safe place. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine it's 3 a.m. You're alone in your bedroom, and you hear something moving in the darkness. Your heart rate spikes, your muscles tense. Every primitive alarm in your brain starts screaming. Now ask yourself, why? Why does darkness still terrify us, even though we're apex predators who've conquered every continent, split the atom, and walked on the moon? Why do we still check under the bed? Why do children cry for nightlights? Why does your rational, modern brain lie to you at 3 a.m., convincing you that something is watching from the shadows? The answer lies 3 million years in the past, in the acacia trees of East Africa, where our ancestors fought a nightly battle for survival that would fundamentally reshape what it means to be human. This isn't just a story about ancient sleep patterns. This is the origin story of fear itself. The sun is setting over the Afar Depression in what will one day be called Ethiopia. The temperature, which reached a scorching 95 degrees Fahrenheit just hours ago, is finally dropping to something bearable. Long shadows stretch across the savanna grassland, turning golden yellow into deep amber, then burnt orange, then finally that peculiar purple-gray that signals the rapid approach of African nightfall. A small figure moves through the scattered acacia trees with urgent purpose. She's barely 4 feet tall, with long, powerful arms and a gait that's neither fully bipedal nor truly quadrupedal, something uniquely in between. This is a female Australopithecus afarensis, and she has approximately 20 minutes before full darkness arrives. She's not alone. Behind her, 3 other members of her group are also climbing, selecting their positions in a medium-sized acacia tree. This isn't random. This specific tree has been used for generations. The branches are worn smooth in certain places from repeated use. The positioning offers multiple escape routes. Most importantly, the tree stands slightly apart from others, making it harder for predators to leap from neighboring trees. But here's what you need to understand. This isn't rest. This is a siege. Modern sleep researchers talk about sleep architecture, the structure of our sleep cycles, how we move through different stages throughout the night. But for Australopithecus, the architecture that mattered wasn't internal. It was the literal architecture of their sleeping platforms. These weren't nests, not yet. Chimpanzees build elaborate sleeping nests, weaving branches into supportive platforms that take 15 minutes to construct. But Australopithecus afarensis hadn't developed that technology yet. Instead, they selected branches, carefully, desperately carefully, and positioned themselves in the forks where multiple branches met. The branch selection process was life or death. Too thin, and you'd fall during the involuntary muscle jerks that come with REM sleep. Too thick, and you couldn't grip properly with your hands and feet. Too low, and you were within striking range of leopards. Too high, and the thin branches couldn't support your weight. Paleoanthropologists have identified the ideal height, between 15 and 25 feet, high enough to be safe from most ground predators, low enough that the branches could still support an adult weighing 65 to 80 pounds. But here's the truly fascinating part. And this is where the fossil evidence combines with modern sleep studies to tell us something profound about human evolution. They couldn't sleep lying down. Think about how you sleep. You lie flat, preferably horizontal, and for about 90 minutes at a time, your body enters REM sleep. During REM sleep, your brain paralyzes your major muscle groups, a safety mechanism to prevent you from acting out your dreams. You become completely vulnerable, unable to move, unable to run. Now imagine experiencing REM sleep while sitting upright in a tree, 20 feet above ground, in complete darkness, surrounded by the sounds of Africa's most efficient predators. You can't. Your body won't let you. And that's exactly what happened to Australopithecus. The fossil record reveals something extraordinary in their skeletal structure. Evidence of chronic sleep disruption built into their very bones. Their cervical vertebrae show stress patterns consistent with a lifetime of sleeping in seated or semi-reclined positions. Their shoulder joints show remarkable flexibility, adaptations for gripping branches during sleep. Their feet retained the opposable big toe of earlier primates, perfect for maintaining grip during unconsciousness. But most tellingly, when we compare their brain cases to their body size, we see something unprecedented. They were operating on a sleep deficit that would hospitalize a modern human within weeks. Modern humans need 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep per night. Miss that consistently, and you develop cognitive impairment, weakened immune systems, increased mortality risk. Yet the evidence suggests Australopithecus was averaging perhaps 4 to 5 hours of highly fragmented sleep per night. How did they survive? Here's where it gets interesting. Recent field studies of modern primates combined with analysis of Australopithecus group dynamics suggest they developed something remarkable. A proto-system of sentinel behavior that would eventually evolve into the most complex social structure on Earth. In our tree, as darkness finally falls complete, the 4 Australopithecus individuals aren't all sleeping simultaneously. At least one is always in a state of light, vigilant rest. Their eyes, larger in proportion to their skull than modern humans, were adapted for low-light conditions. Not nocturnal vision, but something in between. Enough to detect movement in starlight and moonlight. The rotation wasn't conscious or planned. It was instinctive, driven by the same circadian rhythms that still govern our sleep today, but fractured into something more primitive. Polyphasic sleep patterns, where individuals cycled through brief periods of deep sleep, interspersed with longer periods of vigilant resting. Imagine the cognitive cost. Imagine your brain trying to repair itself, consolidate memories, process emotions, all while maintaining just enough consciousness to detect the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves that doesn't match the wind pattern, the subtle change in the night sounds that signals something large and hungry moving below. Let's talk about what was hunting them, because this isn't speculation. We have the fossil evidence. We have the tooth marks. We have the partially consumed remains of Australopithecus individuals, frozen in time, telling us exactly what killed them. The leopard was the primary threat. Panthera pardus, specifically the African leopard subspecies that existed 3 million years ago, was, if anything, more formidable than its modern descendants. Larger, more muscular, with slightly longer canines. But more importantly, they were nocturnal ambush predators specialized in climbing trees. A modern leopard can carry prey twice its own body weight up a tree. An adult male leopard weighs around 130 to 200 pounds. An adult Australopithecus afarensis weighed 65 to 80 pounds. Do the math. Leopards didn't just hunt Australopithecus, they specialized in it. In the Swartkrans cave system in South Africa, paleontologists have found concentrated deposits of early hominin remains showing distinctive leopard predation patterns. The famous Tong-child skull, the first Australopithecus fossil ever discovered, shows puncture marks perfectly matching the spacing of a leopard's canines. But leopards weren't the only nightmare in the dark. Hyenas. Specifically, the giant hyena species Pachycrocuta brevirostris and the spotted hyena Crocuta crocuta. Both were larger than their modern descendants, and both hunted in coordinated packs. Here's what makes hyenas particularly terrifying for a tree-sleeping primate. They're patient. A lion pride might attempt 1 or 2 charges at a tree before giving up. Hyenas will wait. They'll circle. They'll vocalize those famous laughing calls that echo for miles across the savanna. And they learn something about Australopithecus behavior that we can reconstruct from fossil evidence. Given enough pressure, given enough fear, tree-sleeping primates eventually make mistakes. They miss their grip. They choose a weak branch in their panic. They fall. Hyena dens from this period contain juvenile Australopithecus remains with a specific pattern of damage. Broken bones from falls, but not enough to kill instantly. Then the feeding damage that came afterward. The implication is clear and horrible. Hyenas didn't need to climb. They just needed to wait for fear and exhaustion to do their work. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating predator wasn't what they could see, or even what they could smell. It was what they could hear. In the complete darkness of an African night, 3 million years ago, the soundscape was a symphony of death. We can reconstruct this with remarkable accuracy by studying modern African ecosystems and fossil assemblages from the period. The close sounds were the worst. Branches moving when there's no wind, claws scratching against bark, the soft breathing of a large mammal at the base of your tree. That particular vibration through the trunk that means something heavy is testing its weight against the lower branches. But the distant sounds shaped fear itself. The roar of a lion carries up to 5 miles. The laugh of a hyena echoes across the landscape. The distinctive sawing cough of a leopard claims its territory. And underneath it all, the chorus of animals dying, the screams of prey, the panic calls of other primate groups being hunted, the sounds that trigger every instinctive alarm system built into the primate brain. Your ancestors listened to a soundtrack of terror every single night for millions of years. Now we reach the truly profound question. What did this do to their minds? Modern sleep deprivation studies show that humans experiencing chronic sleep fragmentation develop several consistent patterns: hypervigilance, increased startle response, difficulty distinguishing real threats from imagined ones, and, critically, an enhanced ability to detect patterns, even patterns that don't exist. This isn't a bug. It's a feature. When you're sitting in a tree at night, gripping branches in a state of semi-consciousness, your brain can make 2 types of errors. False positives, thinking you see a predator when it's just a branch, or false negatives, not detecting a predator that's actually there. Only one of these errors kills you. So natural selection ruthlessly favored nervous systems that erred on the side of false positives. Better to panic at 100 shadows than to miss the one real leopard. Better to be paranoid than dead. This fundamental asymmetry in the cost of errors shaped human consciousness itself. We became the species that sees patterns everywhere, the species that imagines threats in the dark. the species whose default state is not peaceful rest, but vigilant anxiety. But Australopithecus didn't just passively accept this nightly terror. They adapted. And their adaptations would eventually lead to something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. The fossil record shows a gradual shift in their skeletal structure over hundreds of thousands of years. Their arms grew slightly shorter relative to their legs, better for bipedal movement, worse for tree climbing. This seems counterintuitive until you understand what was happening. They were being forced to choose between being good at running on the ground during the day and being good at climbing at night. They chose running, but that made nights even more dangerous. At the same time, their brain cases were expanding. Not dramatically, that explosive growth was still millions of years in the future, but measurably. And here's what's fascinating. Some paleoneurologists believe we can detect the expansion of specific brain regions associated with vigilance, threat detection, and, crucially, social cooperation. Because here's the secret that made everything else possible. They started sleeping together more intentionally. We have evidence from fossil sites showing that Australopithecus groups grew slightly larger over time. Not dramatically, still small bands of 15 to 30 individuals, but enough to make a difference in vigilance behavior. More individuals meant more eyes, more ears, more noses detecting the scent of predators downwind. But more importantly, more individuals meant something that would reshape the evolutionary trajectory of our lineage. The ability to genuinely sleep while others kept watch. This required something revolutionary. Trust. A chimpanzee sleeping in a tree can rely on instinct, on its own senses, on the strength of its grip. But a hominin engaging in coordinated sentinel behavior has to trust that when it slips into deep sleep, truly deep restorative REM sleep, where its muscles go slack and its awareness fades, others will remain vigilant. This is where modern human psychology has its roots. Not in hunting cooperation, not in tool use. In the desperate nightly gamble that your companions won't let leopards eat you while you're unconscious. The individuals who could form these bonds, who could trust and be trustworthy, survived to reproduce. The individuals who couldn't trust, or couldn't be trusted, either died of sleep deprivation or ended up as leopard food. Night after night, generation after generation, for millions of years. Now we return to that 3 a.m. moment I mentioned at the beginning. You, lying safe in your climate-controlled bedroom, in your predator-free home, in your locked building, possibly several floors above ground level, surrounded by millions of other humans who've created a civilization that has eliminated nearly every major natural threat. Your rational brain knows you're safe. But your amygdala, that ancient almond-shaped cluster of neurons deep in your brain, still thinks you're in a tree. It's still listening for leopards. It's still waiting for the sentinel to fail. It's still ready to jolt you awake at the slightest sound that doesn't fit the pattern. When you check under the bed, you're not being irrational. You're being an Australopithecus. When you leave the bathroom light on, you're not being childish. You're following a survival instinct refined over 3 million years of nightly terror. When you can't sleep in complete darkness, your brain isn't malfunctioning. It's working exactly as it was designed to work. in an environment where complete darkness meant you were about to die. The modern epidemic of sleep disorders, of insomnia, of anxiety that spikes at night, these aren't really modern problems. They're ancient problems, ancient adaptations, ancient survival mechanisms misfiring in an environment they weren't designed for. We domesticated fire. We domesticated animals. We domesticated plants. But we never domesticated the night. Not really. We just got better at hiding from it. In the next chapter, we'll explore how this nightly siege led to one of the most important innovations in human evolution: the first genuine shelters. Not nests in trees, but structures on the ground. And we'll discover that this transition, from sleeping in trees to sleeping on the ground, required such a dramatic shift in behavior, such a revolutionary change in social organization, that it fundamentally altered the trajectory of human consciousness. Because to sleep on the ground, our ancestors needed something even more powerful than sharp teeth or strong muscles. They needed something that no other species on Earth had ever developed to the same degree. They needed fire. They needed language. They needed stories to tell each other in the dark. They needed to become human. But first, they had to survive just one more night in the trees. The night terror that shaped humanity. The descent. Why sleeping on the ground was the most dangerous decision in human history. 2 million years ago, something changed. After more than 1 million years of sleeping in trees, 1 million years of nightly terror, of fragmented sleep, of watching the darkness for movement, our ancestors made a decision that should have killed them. A decision so counterintuitive, so apparently suicidal, that it demands explanation. They climbed down from the trees, and they stayed down. Not occasionally, not just during the day. They began spending their nights on the ground, the killing floor of the African savanna, where every advantage belonged to the predators. Why would they do this? What could possibly make the ground safer than the trees? The answer will surprise you. Because they didn't descend because it was safer. They descended because they had no choice. Let's rewind slightly to understand the environmental catastrophe that forced this transition. Around 2.8 million years ago, the East African climate underwent a dramatic shift. The geological evidence is unambiguous. Oxygen isotope analysis from ancient lake beds, paleobotanical remains, shifts in fossil assemblages. The forests were dying. The climate was becoming more arid. Seasonal droughts grew longer and more severe. The continuous woodland that had covered much of East Africa began fragmenting into isolated patches, separated by increasingly large expanses of open grassland. For tree-sleeping primates, this was an existential crisis. Imagine you're an Australopithecus band of 20 individuals. For generations, your territory included a reliable sleeping grove, a cluster of strong trees close to water sources and feeding grounds. But now, over the course of decades, those trees are dying. The ones that remain are smaller, more scattered, unable to support your entire group. You have 3 options: migrate to find better sleeping trees, compress your group into fewer trees, or adapt to sleeping in increasingly marginal locations. The fossil record shows they tried all 3. and all three led to disaster. Paleoanthropologists have identified what we call mortality spike sites from this period, locations where hominin remains are found in unusual concentrations, often showing evidence of predation. These aren't living sites. They're killing fields. One of the most telling examples comes from the Kubifora Formation in Kenya. Here, researchers found the scattered remains of at least 14 early Homo individuals, the descendants of Australopithecus, concentrated in an area around what was once a small stand of acacia trees near a river bend. The pattern of remains tells a story. Multiple individuals from different age groups, killed over what appears to be a relatively short time period, possibly just a few years. Tooth marks on the bones indicate leopard, hyena, and large cat predation. But most revealing are the bones themselves. They show evidence of chronic stress, nutritional deficiency, and sleep deprivation. This group was trapped. The local trees couldn't support them all safely. They were competing for sleeping positions, which meant some individuals, likely the juveniles and elderly, were forced into dangerous positions. Lower branches, weaker trees, trees too close to the ground. The predators learned this quickly. If you're a leopard and you discover a tree where panicked primates are crammed together, fighting for position, occasionally falling, you've found a reliable food source. You don't even need to climb, you just wait. But migration wasn't working either. When forests are continuous, navigation is relatively simple for a primate. You can travel through the canopy, moving from tree to tree, with the ground always visible as a reference point. Food sources, water sources, and sleeping sites are all integrated into a three-dimensional mental map that gets passed down through generations. But when those forests fragment, that whole system collapses. Suddenly, moving to a new sleeping site means crossing open ground, potentially miles of it. During the day, this was dangerous enough. Australopithecus was not a fast runner. Their bipedalism was still inefficient compared to modern humans. They were vulnerable to every predator on the savanna. But the real problem came at dusk. If you're traveling to a new sleeping site, you need to arrive with enough daylight remaining to assess the trees, select safe branches, and get everyone positioned before darkness falls. Miscalculate by even 30 minutes, and you're trying to climb in twilight while predators are beginning their evening hunt. We know from fossil evidence that many groups didn't make it. Remains have been found scattered along ancient migration routes, individuals who couldn't keep up, who were separated from the group, who made the fatal mistake of trying to sleep in an unfamiliar tree in an unfamiliar territory. The predators didn't even need to hunt. They just followed the migration routes and waited for mistakes. So they were forced to consider the unthinkable, sleeping on the ground. Let's be clear about why this was insane. A human lying on the ground has exactly 0 advantages over any major African predator. You're slower than a leopard, weaker than a hyena, less armored than anything worth eating. Your vision is poor in darkness. Your sense of smell is pathetic compared to the animals hunting you. Your hearing is decent, but not exceptional. Everything about ground sleeping should have resulted in immediate extinction. So why didn't it? The answer lies in a 3-part innovation that emerged gradually over hundreds of thousands of years. We can track this evolution through archaeological sites, fossil assemblages, and comparative analysis with modern hunter-gatherer groups. The earliest evidence of deliberate ground sleeping comes from sites that share specific geographic features. They're not random locations. They show careful, strategic selection. Pattern 1. Elevated positions. Not high enough to require climbing, but raised above the surrounding terrain. Small hills, rocky outcrops, the elevated banks of dried riverbeds. The advantage is simple. Predators approaching uphill make more noise, are easier to detect, and have to work harder to reach you. Pattern 2. Natural barriers on multiple sides. The ideal site has rock faces, steep slopes, or dense thorn bush on at least 2 or 3 sides, leaving only 1 or 2 approaches that need to be actively monitored. Pattern 3. Proximity to water, but not too close. Water sources attract predators, but groups needed to be close enough to reach water at first light without a dangerous march across open terrain. Pattern 4, and this is crucial, sight lines. Early ground sleeping sites consistently show evidence of being positioned where the surrounding terrain is visible, especially in the directions of likely predator approach. But site selection alone wasn't enough. A good location might give you a few extra seconds of warning, but seconds don't matter if you can't defend yourself or escape. That's where the second innovation came in. We need to talk about the Oldowan tool industry. Most people think of these early stone tools, simple flakes and choppers dated to about 2.6 million years ago, as being primarily for processing food, cutting meat, cracking bones, digging roots. But recent experimental archaeology and trauma pattern analysis of fossil remains suggests something more interesting. These tools were dual purpose. Yes, they processed food during the day, but at night, they became the first genuine weapons in human evolution. A chimpanzee threatened by a leopard has limited options: climb, run, or bluff. An Australopithecus with a sharp stone flake has a new option: fight. Not fight and win. That's important to understand. A 70-pound hominin with a stone tool is not defeating a 150-pound leopard in single combat. But they don't need to win. They need to make themselves expensive to kill. Predators operate on a cost-benefit analysis. If attacking you means getting seriously injured, even if they eventually win, they might starve to death from inability to hunt while recovering. Natural selection ruthlessly favors predators who avoid risky prey, even if that prey looks easy. The evidence for defensive tool use comes from several sources. First, Oldowan tools are found at sleeping sites, not just feeding sites. Second, some fossil leopard remains from this period show unusual trauma patterns, deep cuts that healed, suggesting encounters with sharp objects. Third, and most compellingly, we see a shift in predation patterns. Fewer adult hominins killed, more juveniles. The adults, armed and positioned strategically, had become too dangerous to attack casually. But juveniles, who couldn't wield tools effectively, remain vulnerable. This selective pressure, predators targeting the young, would have enormous implications for social evolution, driving the development of extremely protective parental behaviors. But even weapons and good geography weren't enough. Because the real problem with ground sleeping wasn't the first attack, it was the sustained siege. Here's where the timeline gets controversial, fascinating, and ultimately revolutionary. The traditional narrative says that Homo erectus, appearing around 1.9 million years ago, was the first hominin to control fire. with solid evidence appearing around 1.5 million years ago at sites like Kubifora, and later, more definitively, at sites like Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa around 1 million years ago. But there's an emerging body of evidence suggesting something earlier, something more primitive, something that bridges the gap between tree-sleeping Australopithecus and ground-sleeping Homo. The evidence comes from an unusual source: burnt earth at habitation sites that dates to around 1.6 to 1.8 million years ago, before the traditional timeline for fire control. These aren't cooking fires. There's no evidence of roasted food remains. These are something else. They're small, poorly maintained, often just patches of burnt ground with some charcoal and heated rocks. Not the sophisticated hearths that would come later, but something more primitive. Scavenged fire. Picture this. A lightning strike ignites a grassland fire. It burns for days, as African wildfires do, consuming square miles of savanna before rain or a river stops it. In the wake of this fire, smoking logs and coals remain hot for days afterward. A group of early Homo discovers this. They've been watching fire for generations. It's impossible to live in Africa without experiencing wildfires. They know animals flee from it. They know predators avoid it. And one individual, probably during a moment of desperation, makes a cognitive leap. What if we take some with us? Not lighting fire from scratch, that's far beyond their capabilities, but taking a burning branch from a natural fire and keeping it alive? That's significantly simpler. Feed it dry grass, blow on it when it dims, protect it from rain. This fits the archaeological evidence. The burnt patches at early sites don't show the continuous repeated use you'd expect from fire starting. They show sporadic, unpredictable patterns consistent with opportunistic fire maintenance. And it explains something crucial: how ground sleeping became possible before the technology for fire starting existed. Let's reconstruct what this might have looked like based on archaeological evidence, site patterns, and modern experimental archaeology. Location: a low rocky outcrop near a seasonal river in what is now northern Kenya, approximately 1.7 million years ago. Group: 15 individuals of early Homo erectus, the species that would finally make the full transition to ground dwelling. Time: late afternoon. The sun is still above the horizon, but the group is already moving toward their sleeping site. This is new behavior. Tree-sleeping primates can wait until almost dark before climbing. Ground sleepers need hours of preparation. The site they've chosen has been used before. You can tell by the scatter of broken bones and stone tools. But there's something different tonight. 3 days ago, lightning sparked a massive grassland fire 5 miles to the east. This morning, 2 of the group's scouts found the burn area, still smoldering in places. They've brought back something precious. 4 large branches, one end charred and glowing, wrapped in green leaves to slow the burning. It's taken them most of the day to transport these embers back to the sleeping site, carefully feeding them, protecting them, keeping them alive. As darkness approaches, the group organizes with practiced efficiency. This isn't instinctive. It's learned behavior, passed down and refined over generations. The sleeping position is the elevated center of the outcrop, about 15 feet across. Rock face behind them, steep slope on the left, thornbush thicket on the right. 2 approach routes, one from the front, one from the far right where the thornbush thins. The embers are positioned at the front approach. Not a roaring fire, they don't have that yet. Just glowing coals arranged in a rough line, fed with dry grass and small sticks. The heat is barely perceptible 5 feet away, but the glow is visible. The smoke drifts down the slope. The group arranges themselves in a specific pattern that would become universal among human societies. Adults at the perimeter, juveniles in the center, the largest males at the two approach routes. Stone tools within reach. But here's what's revolutionary. For the first time in millions of years of primate evolution, they're lying down to sleep, not sitting, not clinging to branches in a semi-conscious state of vigilance, actually lying down in positions that allow for genuine, deep sleep. This is possible because of the fire, not because fire keeps predators away completely, but because it changes the equation. A predator approaching this site has to cross a visible glow, has to deal with unfamiliar smoke, has to face armed hominins who have seconds of warning instead of milliseconds. Around midnight, we know the timing from modern predator behavior studies. A leopard arrives. She's been tracking this group for 3 days. They've been erratic, unpredictable, spending time near the burn area when they should be foraging. But she's patient. Leopards always are. She approaches from the front, the obvious route. She can see them in the firelight. This is actually a disadvantage for the hominins, their night vision ruined by staring at embers, while her eyes adapt perfectly to the mixed light and shadow. But she pauses at 50 feet. The smoke bothers her. Not enough to turn away, she's hungry, and these primates smell like easy food, but enough to make her cautious. She circles, looking for a better approach. The right side, where the thorn bush thins. She can get within 20 feet before she'd be visible in the firelight. She moves closer. 30 feet. 25. The sleeping hominins don't react. Their hearing isn't acute enough to detect her padded footfalls over the crackle of burning grass. 20 feet. She gathers herself for the charge. And then something unprecedented happens. One of the adult males jerks awake, maybe a random arousal from a dream, maybe some subconscious detection of danger. He doesn't see the leopard, but he does what hominins have been doing for millions of years when danger threatens at night. He vocalizes. Not a scream, not yet. A low, guttural alarm call. The entire group erupts into consciousness. Within 2 seconds, all 15 individuals are awake, oriented, making noise. And the noise they make is something new in evolutionary history. Not panic screams, not random shrieks. Coordinated, loud, aggressive vocalizations. Early Homo had the descended larynx and vocal control that Australopithecus lacked. They're shouting. Proto-language, proto-words, but the intent is clear. We see you. We're awake. We're many. Come closer and we'll hurt you. The leopard, 20 feet away, freezes. Her ambush is blown. These aren't panicked tree primates scrambling in darkness. These are organized, loud, aggressive animals that know she's there. 3 adult males grab stone tools and move toward her position. They don't charge, that would be suicide, but they advance in a line, making themselves appear larger, all of them vocalizing, all of them armed. The cost-benefit calculation shifts. The leopard backs away. Not far. She's still hungry, but far enough. She'll circle. She'll wait. Maybe they'll make a mistake. They don't. The group maintains vigilance for another hour, feeding the embers, keeping them bright, rotating watch. Eventually, the leopard moves on to find easier prey. As dawn breaks, the group is exhausted, but they're alive. All of them. No one fell from a tree because there was no tree to fall from. No juvenile was snatched because the juveniles were protected in the center of the group. For the first time in millions of years, an entire primate group experienced what they desperately needed: genuine sleep. This is where we need to pause and consider what this change meant neurologically. Remember how I explained that Australopithecus operated on chronic sleep deprivation? That their brains were trying to function on 4 to 5 hours of fragmented sleep per night. Now imagine what happens when you suddenly give that brain 7 to 8 hours of consolidated sleep. The archaeological and fossil record from 1.8 to 1.5 million years ago shows an explosive transformation in hominin behavior and physiology. Brain size increases dramatically. Homo erectus has a cranial capacity 50% larger than late Australopithecus, an increase that happens remarkably quickly in evolutionary terms. Tool technology advances. The simple Oldowan choppers give way to more sophisticated Acheulean hand axes, tools that require planning, symmetry, and abstract thinking to produce. Geographic range expands. Homo erectus migrates out of Africa into Asia, a feat that would be impossible for a species still dependent on specific trees for sleeping. Social complexity increases. Evidence of group coordination, food sharing, and care for injured individuals becomes more common in the fossil record. All of these changes require one fundamental resource: cognitive processing power. And cognitive processing power requires sleep. Real, deep, restorative sleep. But this transition wasn't gentle or easy. The fossil record from this transitional period, roughly 2 to 1.5 million years ago, shows something disturbing. Massive hominin mortality. We're not just talking about normal predation rates. We're talking about what appears to be a population bottleneck, a period where hominin numbers crashed dramatically. Why? Because the transition from tree to ground sleeping wasn't complete or universal. Different groups tried different strategies. Some groups clung to tree sleeping, becoming increasingly marginalized as forests shrank. These lineages died out. Some groups attempted ground sleeping without the necessary innovations: no fire, poor site selection, inadequate weapons. They died out even faster. Some groups got caught in between, sleeping on the ground sometimes, reverting to trees when threatened, never fully committing to either strategy. The fossil record suggests these groups suffered the worst mortality of all. They hadn't developed the tree-sleeping vigilance of Australopithecus, but they also hadn't developed the ground-sleeping coordination of Homo erectus. The groups that survived were the ones that made a complete commitment to ground sleeping and invested everything in making it work. Better tools, better site selection, better social coordination, better fire maintenance, and most importantly, better stories. Because here's something that only becomes apparent when you deeply consider the logistics of ground sleeping. It requires teaching. A baby chimpanzee doesn't need to be taught how to sleep in a tree. The behavior is largely instinctive, refined through observation and practice. But ground sleeping with fire and weapons and coordinated vigilance? That's not instinctive. That has to be learned, which means it has to be taught, which means it has to be communicated. The vocalizations that early Homo used to scare off that leopard, those weren't just noise. They were proto-language, early attempts at symbolic communication. And the selection pressure for better communication was intense and immediate. Groups that could communicate better could coordinate better at night. They could teach juveniles where to position themselves. They could warn each other about which predators were in the area. They could share information about which sites were safe and which were death traps. Most importantly, they could tell stories. Not sophisticated narratives with complex grammar, that was still hundreds of thousands of years away, but simple, vital stories. That site bad. Predator came. Fire died. Group member killed. These proto-stories, shared around dying embers, served a function more important than entertainment. They were survival manuals, passed down through generations, containing hard-won information about how to survive the night. But here's the fascinating part. Even as they adapted to ground sleeping, they never forgot the trees. Modern sleep research reveals something extraordinary about human sleep architecture. We still show physiological evidence of our tree-sleeping past. When we enter deep sleep, we experience occasional full-body jerks, hypnic jerks, sudden muscle contractions that jolt us back to consciousness. For years, sleep researchers struggled to explain this. Why would evolution preserve a behavior that disrupts sleep? The answer? It's a vestigial reflex from tree sleeping. When you're dozing in a tree and your muscles start to relax too much, a sudden jerk prevents you from falling. This reflex was so critical for so long that it's still hardwired into our nervous systems millions of years after we stopped sleeping in trees. We also retain the preference for elevated sleeping positions. When given a choice, humans across all cultures prefer to sleep on raised platforms rather than directly on the ground. Beds, cots, hammocks. Cultures that independently invented these furniture pieces never had contact with each other. Yet they all arrived at the same solution: sleep up high when possible. And we retain the fear. That 3 a.m. panic, that sensation of being watched in the dark, that spike of adrenaline when we hear an unexpected sound at night. These aren't malfunctions. They're echoes of tree sleeping, of a million years of justified paranoia, of nights when failing to wake up to a sound meant death. The transition to ground sleeping didn't just change how hominins slept. It changed everything else about how they lived. During the day, tree-sleeping hominins had to stay relatively close to their sleeping groves. You can't be more than a few hours' travel from your sleeping trees when dusk approaches. This limited foraging range, limited territory size, limited everything. Ground-sleeping hominins with portable fire could be more flexible. As long as they could find a defensible position and maintain their embers, they could range much farther. This opened up new food sources, new territories, eventually new continents. The coordination required for defensive group sleeping created stronger social bonds. You don't achieve 8-hour vigilance rotations without trust, without reciprocity, without sophisticated social contracts. "I'll watch while you sleep" is perhaps the first true social promise in human evolution, and the most important. The improved sleep quality meant better cognitive function, which meant better tool use, which meant better hunting, which meant better nutrition, which meant larger brains, which meant even better cognitive function. A positive feedback loop that would eventually produce us. But most profoundly, the transition to ground sleeping fundamentally altered the relationship between hominins and the night. For Australopithecus, night was pure terror, something to be endured in a state of semi-conscious vigilance. For Homo erectus, night became something different. It became a time for social bonding, for teaching, for storytelling, for the quiet moments around dying embers when information was shared, when juveniles learned, when the group cohesion was reinforced. Night was still dangerous, but it was no longer purely terror. It was becoming something uniquely human. But let's not romanticize this too much. The transition to ground sleeping was paid for in blood. For every group that succeeded, dozens died. For every innovation that worked, hundreds failed. The fossil record from this period is a chronicle of experimentation and extinction. Scattered remains at failed sleeping sites. Evidence of entire groups wiped out in single attacks. Lineages that branched off, tried alternative strategies, and vanished without descendants. The groups that survived weren't necessarily smarter or stronger. In many cases, they were just lucky. Lucky to be in the right place when a lightning strike started a fire they could scavenge. Lucky to find a sleeping site with good defensive geography. Lucky that their local predators were slightly less aggressive or numerous. But over hundreds of thousands of years, those small advantages accumulated. The lucky groups survived long enough to refine their techniques. They had more offspring. They passed down more knowledge. They became us. In the next chapter, we'll explore the most remarkable consequence of ground sleeping, something that wouldn't emerge for another 1,000,000 years, but had its roots in those first terrifying nights on the open savanna. The evolution of the modern human sleep cycle, and how our ancestors' war with the darkness ultimately created consciousness itself. Because here's the thing about spending 1,000,000 years being hunted at night. It doesn't just change how you sleep. It changes how you think. The Dream Fortress. How REM sleep and nightmares became humanity's greatest weapon. Here's a question that should keep you awake at night. Why do we dream? Not the poetic answer about processing emotions or the psychological answer about consolidating memories. I mean the evolutionary answer, the survival answer. Because from a purely adaptive standpoint, REM sleep, the stage where vivid dreaming occurs, is biological insanity. During REM sleep, your brain paralyzes your major muscle groups. You can't run. You can't fight. You can't even maintain your posture. Your temperature regulation fails. Your breathing becomes irregular. Your heart rate fluctuates wildly. For a ground-sleeping primate surrounded by predators, REM sleep is a suicide protocol. 90 minutes of complete vulnerability, repeated 4 to 5 times per night. Yet humans spend roughly 2 hours every night in REM sleep, more than any other primate, more than any other mammal of comparable size. We didn't just retain REM sleep despite its dangers, we doubled down on it. Why would evolution do this? What could possibly be worth being paralyzed and defenseless for 2 hours every night in an environment where everything is trying to kill you? The answer is disturbing, profound, and explains why you still wake up at 3 a.m. with your heart pounding from nightmares about being chased by something you can never quite see. Let's establish what we're dealing with. Modern human sleep architecture is radically different from other primates, even our closest relatives. A chimpanzee sleeps about 9 to 10 hours per night, but spends only about 60 to 90 minutes in REM sleep, roughly 10 to 15% of total sleep time. Their REM periods are short, fragmented, and scattered throughout the night. A modern human sleeps 7 to 9 hours but spends 90 to 120 minutes in REM sleep, about 20 to 25% of total sleep time. More critically, our REM periods are consolidated into longer, more intense sessions, with the longest and most vivid REM period occurring in the final sleep cycle before waking. This difference appears gradually in the fossil record, tracked through indirect evidence. changes in cranial capacity, shifts in the structure of brain cases that suggest altered brain organization, and most tellingly, changes in social behavior that can only be explained by enhanced cognitive processing. The transition happens roughly between 1.5 million and 500,000 years ago, corresponding with the emergence and refinement of Homo heidelbergensis, the species that would eventually give rise to both Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens. But why? What selective pressure could possibly favor spending more time in a vulnerable state? In 2000, a Finnish neuroscientist named Antti Revonsuo proposed something radical. The primary function of dreaming is threat simulation. Dreams, particularly nightmares, are a biological virtual reality system designed to rehearse responses to dangerous situations. When Revonsuo first proposed this, it was met with skepticism. But as more evidence accumulated from neuroscience, evolutionary biology, and cross-cultural dream studies, the hypothesis became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Here's what we know. First, dreams across all human cultures share common threatening themes: being chased, being attacked, falling, losing loved ones, failing to escape danger. These themes appear even in children too young to have experienced real threats. Second, the brain regions active during REM sleep are precisely the ones involved in threat detection and escape planning. The amygdala, fear response; the hippocampus, spatial navigation and memory; and the anterior cingulate cortex, conflict monitoring and decision-making. Third, people who experience more threatening dreams show enhanced performance in real-world threat detection tasks. They're faster at spotting predators in camouflage tests. They're better at escape route planning. They show quicker reaction times to unexpected dangers. Fourth, and this is the clincher, REM sleep deprivation specifically impairs threat response. People deprived of REM sleep, but not other sleep stages, show normal cognitive function in most domains, but their threat detection and escape planning abilities plummet. The evidence points to a stunning conclusion. Dreams aren't a bug in the system. They're a feature. Specifically, they're a training simulator for survival. Now let's think about this from the perspective of our ancestors between 1.5 million and 500,000 years ago. They're ground sleeping. They've got fire, increasingly reliable fire, as they develop better techniques for maintenance and eventually for creating fire from scratch. They've got weapons. They've got coordinated group defense. But they've also got a problem. How do you teach a juvenile hominin to survive a leopard attack when leopard attacks are relatively rare, incredibly fast, and almost always fatal if you make a mistake? You can't practice. You can't drill. One failed training session and your offspring is dead. This is where REM sleep provides an elegant solution. Every night, the brain runs simulations. Not random simulations, evolutionarily relevant simulations. Threats that actually existed in the ancestral environment. Let me paint you a picture of what this might have looked like neurologically. Location: a sleeping site near Lake Turkana, approximately 800,000 years ago. Subject: a 14-year-old Homo heidelbergensis female, entering her fourth REM cycle of the night, about 90 minutes before dawn. Her body is paralyzed, but her brain is blazing with activity. Specifically, Her amygdala is firing at rates comparable to waking fear response. Her hippocampus is constructing a spatial environment. Her visual cortex is generating imagery despite her eyes being closed. She's dreaming. But calling it a dream undersells what's happening. Her brain is running a survival simulation with life or death stakes.
In the dream, she's at the sleeping site, but the details are wrong, distorted as dreams are. The fire is too small, the defensive positions are scattered, and something is moving in the darkness at the edge of the firelight. Her dream self knows what it is before she sees it. Leopard. The largest she's ever seen, with eyes that catch the firelight in a way that triggers every alarm system in her amygdala. Now here's where it gets interesting from a neuroscience perspective. Her brain is generating this threat, but it's also generating her response to it. She's not passive in this dream. She's making decisions, testing strategies, experiencing the consequences. First response? Freeze. In the dream, this fails. The leopard moves closer. Her brain simulates the sensation of its approach, the sound of padding feet, the smell of carnivore musk, the visual of muscles bunching for a spring. Second response, call for help. Her dream self tries to shout, but the sound comes out wrong, distorted, ineffective. This is the brain testing what happens if communication fails. Third response, grab a weapon and move to defensive position. In the dream, she successfully reaches the stone tools, successfully positions herself between the predator and the younger children in the group. The leopard charges. Her dream self experiences every sensation, the rush of adrenaline, the decision about when to strike, the feel of the stone tool connecting, the leopard's weight slamming into her, the terror, the pain. And then, this is crucial, she wakes up. She bolts awake, heart hammering, muscles trying to move against the lingering paralysis of REM sleep. For a few seconds, she's disoriented, the dream threat still vivid, her brain uncertain whether the danger is real or simulated. The actual sleeping site is peaceful. The fire is burning steadily. The sentries are alert but relaxed. No leopard, no danger. But something remarkable has just happened in her brain. During that nightmare, her neural pathways for threat response have been strengthened. The next time she faces a real leopard, if she ever does, her reaction time will be microseconds faster. Her decision-making will be more efficient. Her motor patterns will be more refined. She's just completed a training session that would be impossible to replicate in waking life without potentially fatal consequences. And she's not alone. Across the sleeping site, other members of the group are experiencing their own simulations. Different threats, different scenarios, different lessons. Over the course of a lifetime, a Homo heidelbergensis individual might experience thousands of these simulated threats, each one refining their survival responses, each one building a threat detection system that's more sophisticated than anything that could be learned through direct experience alone. We can't access the actual dreams of extinct hominins, obviously, but we can make educated inferences based on comparative psychology and cross-cultural dream research. Modern human dreams, when analyzed across cultures with minimal contact, show remarkable consistency in threat themes. Being chased. This appears in roughly 80% of people's dream reports across all cultures studied. The pursuer is often vague, animalistic, or changes form. This maps perfectly onto predator escape scenarios. the brain practicing evasion without committing to a specific predator type. Falling, reported by roughly 60% of dreamers. This is likely a holdover from tree sleeping, where falling was one of the primary causes of death. Even though we've been ground sleeping for over 1 million years, the simulation persists. Losing teeth. This one appears in about 40% of dream reports, and is often dismissed as purely psychological. But consider, for a Pleistocene hominin, dental damage was potentially fatal. You can't process food properly. You're more vulnerable to infection. Tooth loss simulation might be the brain's way of practicing dietary adjustment strategies. Being unable to move or fight. About 50% of people report this. It's often interpreted as stress-related, but from an evolutionary perspective, it might be practicing what to do when physically overpowered, when fighting back isn't an option and other strategies, playing dead, verbal negotiation, appeasing behavior, need to be accessed. Losing loved ones. This appears in roughly 70% of dream reports. For a species that depends on group cohesion for survival, the death of group members is an existential threat. These dreams might be practicing emotional regulation and social reorganization strategies. Now layer on the specific threats of the Pleistocene environment. Large cats, leopards, lions, the extinct saber-toothed cats, fast ambush predators that hunt at night. Hyenas, pack hunters that employ persistence and intimidation tactics. Rival hominin groups, competition for resources, sleeping sites, and territory. Evidence of intergroup violence dates back at least 500,000 years. Environmental hazards. Flash floods, lightning strikes, cliff edges, unstable terrain in darkness. The brain would simulate all of these, running thousands of scenarios over a lifetime, building a comprehensive threat response library that no individual could possibly experience directly and survive. But here's where the system shows its limitations and its costs. The threat simulation system works brilliantly when the threats are real, immediate, and frequent enough to warrant constant practice. In the Pleistocene environment, this was true. Predator encounters were common. Intergroup conflict was regular. Environmental dangers were constant. But what happens when you take this finely tuned threat simulation system and drop it into the modern world, where actual life-threatening dangers are rare? The system doesn't turn off. It can't turn off. It's hardwired too deeply into our neurobiology, so it starts generating threats that don't exist. It takes minor social anxieties and amplifies them into existential crises. It takes vague worries about job security and transforms them into visceral nightmares of falling, chasing, losing everything. This is why modern humans suffer from anxiety disorders at such high rates. It's not that we're psychologically broken. It's that we're running Pleistocene software in a 21st century environment. Your brain's threat simulation system is still practicing for leopards, for hyenas, for rival groups competing for scarce resources. But since those threats don't exist in your daily life, the system repurposes modern anxieties, deadlines, social rejection, financial stress, and runs them through the same neural pathways that evolved to handle life-or-death predator encounters. This is why a work presentation can trigger the same physiological response as being chased by a predator. Your amygdala can't tell the difference between "I might get eaten" and "I might embarrass myself in front of colleagues." Both are processed as existential threats worthy of full fight or flight activation. But REM sleep does more than simulate threats. This is where things get even more interesting. The standard scientific narrative says REM sleep is primarily about memory consolidation, sorting through the day's experiences, deciding what to keep and what to discard, integrating new information into existing knowledge structures. This is true, but it's not the whole story. Recent research suggests that REM sleep doesn't just consolidate any memories. It preferentially consolidates emotional memories, particularly negative emotional memories. Specifically, it consolidates the emotional component while reducing the visceral fear response. Let me explain what this means in practical terms. Imagine a Homo heidelbergensis individual who, during the day, had a close encounter with a predator. They survived, but it was terrifying. If they simply stored this memory as pure terror, they'd become paralyzed by fear, unable to function near any location that resembled the attack site. But if they could retain the tactical information, what worked, what didn't work, how the predator moved, what warning signs preceded the attack, while reducing the paralyzing fear, they'd have actionable intelligence without debilitating trauma. That's what REM sleep does. It takes traumatic experiences and essentially edits them, preserving the survival-relevant information while dampening the emotional overwhelm. This process happens during REM sleep through a fascinating mechanism. The amygdala is highly active, replaying the emotional memory, but simultaneously, norepinephrine, the neurotransmitter associated with stress and fear, is at its lowest levels of the entire 24-hour cycle. It's as if the brain is running the trauma tape while the fear circuit is turned off, allowing the memory to be integrated without triggering a full stress response. But this system has a dark side that we're only beginning to understand. What happens when the traumatic experiences are too severe? When they overwhelm the REM sleep processing system? Modern research on PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, reveals something fascinating and horrible. People with PTSD show disrupted REM sleep patterns. Specifically, their norepinephrine levels during REM sleep remain elevated. The fear circuit doesn't turn off properly. This means their brain keeps trying to process the trauma but can't successfully edit it. They end up stuck in a loop, replaying the traumatic memory with full emotional intensity, night after night, never achieving the resolution that normal REM sleep provides. Now think about this in the context of Pleistocene hominins. They're experiencing traumatic events regularly. Predator attacks, watching group members killed, starvation, injuries, childbirth complications, intergroup violence. If their REM sleep system was identical to ours, they would have been psychologically destroyed within years. The trauma accumulation would have made them non-functional. This suggests something important. The hominin REM sleep system must have been even more efficient at trauma processing than ours. They needed to be able to integrate horrible experiences rapidly, extract the survival information, and move on emotionally. This might explain why modern humans seem almost pathologically resilient to trauma in some contexts, while being devastated by it in others. We inherited a trauma processing system designed for regular, severe, life-threatening experiences. but that system has been deprived of the environment it evolved in, leading to unpredictable responses to modern stressors. But there's another layer to this that's even more fascinating: the social function of dreams. Archaeological evidence from around 400,000 years ago, coinciding with the appearance of more sophisticated Homo heidelbergensis populations, shows something interesting. Sleeping sites become more organized, with evidence of specific individuals occupying the same positions night after night. This isn't random. It suggests role specialization was emerging. Some individuals were better sentries. Some were better at maintaining fire. Some were better at organizing group defense. And some were better at dreaming. I know that sounds strange, but bear with me. Cross-cultural research shows that some individuals consistently have more vivid, more complex, more narrative-structured dreams than others. This trait appears to be partly genetic, partly developmental. In a Pleistocene context, individuals with exceptional dream vividness would have served a crucial social function. They could report their threat simulations to the group. Picture this. Dawn breaks at a sleeping site. The group is waking, starting their daily routines. But before they disperse to forage, they engage in what might be the first true human ritual: dream sharing. An individual who had a particularly vivid nightmare describes it to the group. Not just, "I had a bad dream," but detailed tactical information. "I dreamed the leopard came from the uphill side past the thorn barrier just before dawn. In the dream, it worked because the sentries were watching the downhill approach." This isn't superstition or mysticism. This is practical intelligence gathering from the brain's threat simulation system. The group can now adjust their defensive positions to account for this simulated threat, without having to actually experience a leopard attack from that direction. Over generations, this dream-sharing behavior would have become formalized. The best dreamers, the individuals whose simulations most accurately predicted real threats, would gain social status. Their dreams would be taken seriously. They would be consulted before major decisions. Sound familiar? This is the origin of shamanism, of prophetic traditions, of the social role of visionary that appears in every human culture ever studied. And here's where REM sleep connects to perhaps the most important development in human evolution: complex language. To share dreams, you need sophisticated language. You need past tense. You need subjunctive mood. What if the leopard had come from? You need vocabulary for internal states. You need narrative structure. The selection pressure for language development was always assumed to be primarily about daytime coordination, hunting, gathering, social negotiation. But what if the primary driver was actually dream sharing? Think about it. Daytime activities can be coordinated through gestures, demonstrations, and simple vocalizations. But dreams? Dreams exist entirely in internal experience. There's no way to demonstrate a dream. You can only describe it, which requires abstract language. The archaeological record shows a massive leap in symbolic behavior around 300,000 to 200,000 years ago. Complex tools that show evidence of teaching, pigments used for body decoration, and the first possible evidence of ritual behavior. This timing coincides exactly with genetic evidence for the development of modern language capacity. The FOXP2 gene, critical for the fine motor control of speech, shows signs of intense selection pressure in this exact time period. What if this wasn't coincidence? What if the evolution of complex language was driven partly by the need to share increasingly sophisticated dream simulations? But here's where things get truly strange. Once hominins developed the ability to share dreams linguistically, something unprecedented happened. They could dream about dreams. Let me explain. Your great-great-great-grandmother, thousands of greats ago, has a nightmare about a leopard attack. She shares this dream with the group. You hear this story as a child. That night, you dream about the scenario she described. Your dream isn't based on direct experience. It's based on a linguistic description of someone else's dream. It's a second-order simulation, a copy of a copy. But your brain processes it with the same neural machinery, strengthens the same threat response pathways, extracts the same tactical information. This is recursive learning. This is culture. This is the beginning of accumulated knowledge that transcends individual experience. Now fast forward this process across thousands of generations. Each generation is dreaming not just about actual threats, but about threats described by their parents, their grandparents, threats that might be centuries old, threats that might never have actually occurred, but were themselves simulations passed down through dream sharing. This creates a collective threat library, a shared simulation database that's far more comprehensive than any individual could develop through direct experience. And then, somewhere around 50,000 to 40,000 years ago, something remarkable happens. This recursive dream-sharing system starts generating content that has never existed in reality. We call these myths. The earliest cave paintings, Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira, show something fascinating. They depict animals with perfect naturalistic accuracy. The artists clearly observe these animals carefully, but they also show things that don't exist: human-animal hybrids, animals with exaggerated features, scenes that defy known animal behavior. These aren't random inventions. They're dream content. They're the product of millions of years of REM sleep threat simulation, now so abstracted from direct experience that it's generating novel combinations, new scenarios, archetypal images that tap into the deep structure of the threat response system. The lion-headed figure from Hohenstein-Stadel, carved 40,000 years ago. That's not just art. That's a materialized nightmare, a threat simulation made physical, possibly so it can be shared and discussed more effectively. This is why mythological creatures across unconnected cultures show similar patterns. They're built from the same REM sleep simulation system. Dragons are basically super predators, combining features of snakes, big cats, and raptors, all ancient threats. Demons are nocturnal humanoid predators, basically the nightmare version of rival hominin groups. Ghosts are the dead who remain threatening, the brain's way of maintaining vigilance about disease, violence, and social betrayal, even after the immediate threat is gone. Now we return to the modern human experience. You, lying in bed at 3 a.m., heart pounding from a nightmare you can't quite remember. What you're experiencing isn't random. It's not meaningless. It's the echo of 1,000,000 years of threat simulation, tuned and refined by countless generations of ancestors who survived precisely because their brains ran these simulations. The nightmare about being chased? That's your brain practicing predator evasion, using motor planning circuits that evolved when being chased meant death. The nightmare about falling? That's tree sleeping vigilance, still active after millions of years on the ground. The nightmare about teeth falling out? That's dental injury simulation, testing nutritional backup strategies. The nightmare about showing up naked to an important event? That's social exclusion simulation, because for a Pleistocene hominin, being rejected by the group meant death almost as surely as being caught by a leopard. Your nightmares aren't tormenting you. They're training you. The problem is that they're training you for a world that no longer exists. And here's the final, disturbing piece of the puzzle. Modern humans are chronically REM sleep deprived. We average 7 to 8 hours of sleep per night if we're lucky. But we accomplish this by using artificial light, which disrupts natural sleep cycles. We use alarm clocks, which interrupt sleep architecture. We consume caffeine, which suppresses deep sleep stages. The result? We're getting less REM sleep than our ancestors did, despite living in a vastly safer environment. This creates a perverse situation. Our brains are trying to run more threat simulations because the modern world is full of abstract threats that the system interprets as life or death dangers, but we're giving them less time to do it. This might explain the explosion in anxiety disorders, depression, and other mental health conditions in modern society. It's not just that we're stressed, it's that we're not getting enough REM sleep to properly process that stress through the evolutionary mechanisms designed for the purpose. The fortress isn't external. It never was. The fortress is inside your skull, built over millions of years of nights, constructed from nightmares and trauma and fear, refined by generations of ancestors who survived precisely because they dreamed better, deeper, more terrifyingly than those who didn't. Every nightmare you have is a brick in that fortress. Every moment of 3 a.m. terror is maintenance on the walls. Every vivid dream of being chased, of falling, of failing to protect those you love, these aren't weaknesses. They're the fortress doing its job, running its drills, maintaining the threat response systems that kept your ancestors alive. The problem isn't that you dream too much or too vividly. The problem is that you're trying to use a Pleistocene threat detection fortress to navigate a world of email deadlines and social media anxiety. In the next chapter, we'll explore how this created the final piece of the puzzle, how the combination of ground sleeping, fire control, and REM sleep simulation led to the emergence of something entirely unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. We'll explore how nightmares created consciousness itself. Because here's the thing about spending millions of years running internal simulations of threats, sharing those simulations with others, and building recursive layers of simulation upon simulation. Eventually, you develop the ability to run simulations of yourself. You develop the ability to imagine yourself in situations you've never experienced, to plan for futures that don't yet exist, to remember pasts that you've edited and re-edited through countless REM sleep cycles. You develop the ability to ask, what if? And once you can ask, what if? You're no longer just a primate surviving the night. You're something entirely new. The first morning. How dawn rituals created theory of mind and the birth of I. There is a moment every single morning that modern humans barely notice. A moment so mundane, so automatic, that we've forgotten it's one of the most evolutionarily significant transitions in our entire day. The moment you wake up. Not the gradual drift toward consciousness. Not the grogginess of morning. I'm talking about that specific instant when your brain shifts from the dream world to the waking world. When you remember who you are, where you are, and that you survived another night. For you, this takes milliseconds. Your eyes open, you orient to your bedroom. You check your phone. You start your day. For your ancestors 300,000 years ago, this moment was something entirely different. It was the most dangerous, most cognitively complex, most socially critical moment of their entire existence. Because waking up wasn't just about consciousness, it was about counting. Picture a sleeping site in the Rift Valley, what will eventually be called Tanzania. The sky is beginning to lighten. Not sunrise yet, but that pre-dawn blue that signals the end of the night siege. Around a dying fire, 22 individuals of archaic Homo sapiens are beginning to stir. The sentries, who have been rotating through the night in shifts that are now highly structured, almost ritualized, are experiencing the final burst of alertness that comes with successfully completing their duty. But the first person to fully wake isn't a sentry. It's an older female, perhaps 40 years old, ancient by Pleistocene standards, who occupies a position of status in the group. She's not the strongest, she's not the best hunter, but she has a different skill that has proven invaluable over decades of survival. She has memory. Specifically, she has the ability to remember who was where when they went to sleep. Her eyes open. Immediately, and I mean immediately, within seconds, her brain begins a process that no other species on Earth performs with the same urgency or sophistication. She counts the living. 1, 2, 3. Her eyes move systematically across the sleeping site, identifying individuals. 4, 5, 6. Each face is checked, each breathing pattern assessed. 7, 8, 9. At 15, she pauses. Someone is missing from their usual position. Her heart rate spikes. This is the moment of maximum danger, not because an attack is imminent, but because the cognitive calculation she must now perform is staggeringly complex. Is the missing person dead? Taken by a predator during the night? Simply sleeping in a different position? Out at the latrine area? Did they wake early and wander off in the darkness? A potentially fatal mistake. More importantly, does anyone else know they're missing? This is where we need to pause and understand something fundamental about human cognition. That simple question, does anyone else know, represents a cognitive leap that separates humans from virtually every other species. It requires what psychologists call theory of mind. The ability to model other individuals' mental states, to understand that others have knowledge different from your own, to simulate what someone else knows or doesn't know. A chimpanzee can understand that another chimpanzee sees something. That's first-order theory of mind. He sees the banana. But our elder female at the sleeping site is operating at second-order, possibly third-order theory of mind. I know that the missing person is gone. Does the sentry know? If the sentry knows, did they consider it important enough to wake someone? If they didn't wake someone, does that mean they assessed the situation as safe? Or does it mean they didn't notice? This is recursive modeling of other minds, simulating not just what others know, but what they think about what they know, and what they might do based on what they think they know. And she has to perform this calculation in seconds, in a state of partial wakefulness, with the urgency of potential life or death consequences. She makes a decision. She vocalizes. Not a scream, not an alarm call, but something more sophisticated, a specific sound pattern that the group has developed over generations. A proto-word that roughly translates to status check. Someone is missing from expected position. This vocalization does something remarkable. It forces other members of the group to perform the same counting ritual she just completed. Within seconds, other individuals are waking, assessing, counting. The sentry responds with a different vocalization. Known. Individual went to latrine area. Still within protective perimeter. No threat detected. The tension releases. The elder female's heart rate drops. The group begins the normal waking routine. But something profound just happened. Information was exchanged about information. Mental states were communicated. The group engaged in what's called collective intentionality, shared awareness of a situation that requires coordinated mental modeling. This isn't communication about the external world, predator near tree. This is communication about internal models of the world. I am uncertain about something. Do you have information that resolves my uncertainty? This is the foundation of human language. Not words for things, but words for thoughts about things. Now, you might be thinking, this is all speculation. How could we possibly know that dawn counting rituals occurred 250,000 years ago? We can't know for certain, but we have convergent lines of evidence that make it highly probable. Evidence 1. Sleeping site organization. Archaeological sites from this period show increasingly formalized spatial organization, specific areas for specific individuals, consistent patterns across multiple occupations of the same site. This suggests role specialization and predictable positioning, exactly what you'd need for an effective dawn count. Evidence 2. Modern hunter-gatherer behavior. Every hunter-gatherer society ever studied, from the Hadza of Tanzania to the San of the Kalahari to the Aboriginal Australians, performs some version of a dawn count ritual. Despite having no contact with each other for potentially 50,000 plus years, they all independently developed the same basic practice. Upon waking, verify that all group members survived the night. The universality suggests deep evolutionary roots. Evidence 3. Childhood development patterns. Human children show spontaneous emergence of morning counting behaviors around age 3 to 4, coinciding with the development of theory of mind. They wake up and immediately want to know, where's mommy? Where's daddy? Where's sibling? This behavior appears even in children who've never been taught it, suggesting it's at least partly instinctive. Evidence 4. Neurological evidence. Brain imaging studies show that the transition from sleep to waking activates specific neural networks involved in social cognition, specifically the medial prefrontal cortex and temporoparietal junction, areas critical for theory of mind. This activation happens within seconds of waking and appears to be automatic. Your brain literally checks for social information before it fully processes your physical environment. You identify who's present before you fully remember where you are. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. The dawn count isn't just about counting others. It's about being counted. Think about what it means to wake up and realize you're being observed, assessed, verified as alive. You become aware that you exist in other minds, that your presence or absence matters, that you are an object of attention and concern. This external perspective, seeing yourself as others see you, is the foundation of self-awareness. Let me walk you through how this might have developed. Stage 1. Simple presence detection, 2+ million years ago. Group member is here, or group member is not here. This requires minimal theory of mind. Even social primates do this. Stage 2. Position expectation, 1.5 million years ago. Group member should be in this location based on yesterday's sleeping position. This requires memory and pattern recognition, but not necessarily theory of mind. Stage 3. Status assessment, 500,000 years ago. Group member is in unusual position. This might indicate threat, injury, or important information. This requires theory of mind, understanding that unusual behavior has meaning. Stage 4. Mental state inference, 300,000 years ago. Group member is missing. Other members are also noticing this. They are uncertain. I should communicate my knowledge to resolve collective uncertainty. This requires recursive theory of mind, modeling others, modeling you. Stage 5. Self as object awareness, 200,000 years ago. I am being counted. My presence matters to the group. My absence would cause concern. Therefore, I exist as a significant entity in others' minds. This final stage is the birth of the self-concept. Not just awareness, all animals have awareness, but awareness of awareness, the ability to model yourself as an object in other minds, and then to internalize that external model as your own self-concept. This is the moment when I becomes possible as a concept. Before this, hominins had experience. They had sensations, emotions, intentions. But they didn't have a unified concept of I as a persistent entity that exists across time and in the minds of others. The evidence for this emergence comes from multiple domains. Symbolic behavior explosion, 200,000 to 100,000 years ago. Suddenly we see evidence of personal ornamentation. Beads, ochre pigments used on bodies, modified shells. These aren't functional objects, they're identity markers. They signal, this is me. I am distinct from others. Burial practices, 100,000 years ago. The first intentional burials appear. This represents something extraordinary, not just grief. Elephants show grief, but the concept that an individual continues to exist as a distinct entity even after death, worthy of specific treatment. Artistic representation, 40,000 years ago. The first unambiguous depictions of individual humans, not generic figures, but individuals with distinct features, adornments, postures. Someone is saying, this is a specific person. They have an identity worth recording. But all of this traces back to the dawn count, to that morning ritual where you learn that you are seen, you are known, you are remembered. But self-awareness comes with a terrible price, one that we're still paying. Once you understand that you exist as a distinct entity in the minds of others, you can't unknow it. And once you can model yourself as others see you, you inevitably begin to worry about that model. This is the origin of social anxiety, of shame, of reputation management, of the grinding awareness that you are constantly being evaluated, judged, counted. More horrifyingly, once you can model yourself as a persistent entity across time, you inevitably arrive at a realization that no other species appears to fully grasp. You are going to die. Not just, I might be in danger right now, which any animal understands, but I, as a persistent entity, will someday cease to exist. This awareness, this curse of mortality salience, shows up in the archaeological record at the same time as burial practices. It's not coincidence. Burials are the evidence that someone understood death not as an event, but as a state, a permanent absence of a persistent self. Back at our sleeping site, the group is now fully awake. The sun is cresting the horizon. The danger of night has passed, not eliminated. Predators hunt during the day too, but reduced significantly. And something remarkable happens. Something that has been building for hundreds of thousands of years, but reaches full expression in archaic Homo sapiens. They talk. Not about immediate survival needs, where to forage, which route to take. They talk about the night that just passed. Did you hear the hyenas at the eastern perimeter? The fire nearly went out during third watch. I had a dream about the leopard. It came from above, dropping from the rocks. This is the first true conversation in human history. Communication for the purpose of sharing internal experience, not coordinating external action. And it serves a function that's easy to miss. This conversation is literally constructing a shared reality. Each individual experienced the night differently. The sentries stayed awake at different shifts. The dreamers had different simulations. The sleepers heard different sounds. But by sharing these experiences verbally, they create a collective narrative of the night. They synchronize their mental models. They agree on what happened, what it means, what to do about it. This is the foundation of human culture. Not tools, not fire, but the morning conversation where individual experiences are woven into collective memory. But there's a problem with this system. Memory degrades. An individual might remember their own experiences from last night clearly, experiences from a week ago less clearly, a month ago vaguely, a year ago almost not at all. This is fine for most animals. Yesterday's experience is more relevant than last year's anyway. But for humans trying to survive the night, old information can be crucial. That leopard attack that happened during the dry season 2 years ago, was it from the eastern approach or the western approach? That sleeping site that was abandoned after multiple deaths, was it near the acacia grove or the fig trees? Individual memory can't reliably store this information, but collective memory can. This is where elder individuals, like our 40-year-old female, become invaluable. They're not just participants in the morning conversation. They're archivists. She has experienced more mornings than anyone else in the group. She has participated in more dawn conversations. She has heard more stories about nights that happened before she was even born. She is a living library of survival information. And here's what makes this revolutionary. She doesn't just remember information. She remembers the structure of information. She knows which stories are more reliable, witnessed by many individuals, versus less reliable, heard from one person who heard it from their grandmother. She knows which patterns have proven accurate over time versus which were false alarms. She is performing proto-historiography, the evaluation of the reliability of historical accounts. But the morning conversation doesn't just cover survival information. It covers something even more important: social information. Did you notice that the young male was careless with the fire? The new mother is exhausted. She needs someone to help with childcare tonight. Those two hunters are arguing again. It's becoming disruptive. This is gossip. And gossip is perhaps the most important innovation in human evolution. Here's why. In a group of 20 individuals, there are 190 possible social relationships, each individual's relationship with each other individual. Tracking all of these relationships, who can be trusted, who is competent, who is contributing versus free-riding, is cognitively overwhelming for any individual. But if information about social relationships is shared through morning gossip, the cognitive load is distributed. You don't need to directly observe everyone's behavior. You can rely on others' observations, weighted by their reliability. This is collective computation of social networks. It's a distributed intelligence system that allows human groups to scale far beyond what individual cognitive limitations would permit. Chimpanzee groups max out at about 50 individuals, because beyond that size, individual chimps can't track all the social relationships. The network becomes too complex. Human groups can scale to 150+ individuals, Dunbar's number, because we don't rely on direct observation alone. We rely on communally shared information about social networks, updated every morning through gossip. But to gossip effectively, you need a way to refer to specific individuals who aren't present. This is where names become necessary. Early proto-language could handle present-tense communication about visible things. That predator, this food, those tools. But gossip requires discussing absent individuals. The hunter who wasn't at the morning gathering. The mother whose child died last season. The elder who remembers the big drought. These descriptions are clunky and ambiguous. What you need is a unique identifier, a name. The archaeological evidence for names is obviously indirect, but we can infer their existence from the emergence of individual burial practices around 100,000 years ago. If you're going to inter a specific person in a specific location with specific grave goods, you must have a way to identify them uniquely. But names do something more than identify. They crystallize the self-concept. When you have a name, a sound that refers specifically to you, that persists across contexts, that others use to discuss you when you're not present, you become undeniably real as a distinct entity. Your name proves that you exist in others' minds, even when you're not there to be observed. It's evidence of your persistent self across time and space. Now we get to the truly mind-bending part. Once you understand that others have names and persistent identities, once you participate in gossip about absent individuals, you inevitably arrive at a disturbing realization. People gossip about you when you're not present. You exist in conversations you never hear. Your reputation is being constructed and modified in your absence. Decisions about you are being made by people modeling your behavior, your reliability, your value to the group. This awareness creates what psychologists call meta-consciousness. Awareness of being aware, thinking about thinking, modeling others modeling you. It's a hall of mirrors. You imagine what others think about you. Then you imagine what they think you think about them. Then you imagine what they think you think they think about you. This recursive modeling of minds can spiral infinitely, limited only by cognitive processing power. And it's exhausting. This is why human social life is so psychologically demanding. We're constantly running complex simulations of social networks, updating models based on new information, trying to predict and influence how others perceive us. This is also why mornings are often accompanied by social anxiety. The moment you wake up, your brain immediately begins updating its social models. What did I say yesterday that might have offended someone? Did I contribute enough to the group effort? Did anyone notice my mistake? This morning anxiety isn't pathological. It's the social monitoring system that evolved from the dawn count, scaled up to handle complex social networks, and running constantly to maintain your position in the group hierarchy. Because here's what your brain understands at a deep, evolutionary level. If the group decides you're not worth keeping around, if you're absent from the dawn count and nobody cares, you're dead. Social exclusion in the Pleistocene was a death sentence. No individual could survive alone. No individual could defend against predators, find food, maintain fire, without group support. So your brain treats social exclusion as an existential threat, triggering the same alarm systems that respond to predators, starvation, or injury. This is why social rejection hurts, literally hurts, activating the same neural pathways as physical pain. Your brain is screaming at you. This threatens your survival. But the morning conversation does something even more profound. It creates the human experience of time. Animals live in an eternal present. They can remember the past and anticipate the future, but they don't conceptualize time as a dimension they move through. Humans do. And the evidence suggests this conceptualization emerged from the morning ritual. Think about the structure of the dawn conversation. Last night, the hyenas approached from the east. Past. Tonight, we should post extra sentries on that side. Future. We should have done that before. Counterfactual past. If we had, maybe the fire wouldn't have been threatened. Counterfactual consequence. This is time travel. Mental time travel. The ability to situate yourself at different points in time, to imagine alternative pasts and possible futures, to construct causal chains that span temporal distances. And it all starts with this: every morning you are counted. Every morning you count others. Every morning you participate in the conversation that bridges yesterday and tomorrow. This daily verification of continued existence constructs the narrative self, the sense that you are a character in an ongoing story, with a past, present, and future that form a coherent arc. And once you have a narrative self, you inevitably begin to edit that narrative. The morning conversation isn't just reporting what happened, it's constructing a story about what happened. And stories require interpretation. emphasis, omission. I was vigilant during my sentry shift. Maybe you were. Maybe you dozed briefly but don't want to admit it. The leopard was unusually large. Maybe it was. Maybe fear and darkness made it seem larger than it really was. I had a prophetic dream. Maybe you did. Maybe you're retrofitting your vague dream to match morning events. This isn't necessarily lying. It's narrative construction, the process by which raw experience gets shaped into communicable story. And because you're both the teller and the audience of your own narrative, you begin to believe your edited version. You construct a self-concept that's partly based on actual experience and partly based on the stories you tell about your experience. This is why human memory is so unreliable. We're not recording devices. We're storytellers, constantly editing and revising our personal narratives to maintain coherence, manage social reputation, and make sense of ambiguous experiences. Now we arrive at the present moment. You waking up in your comfortable bed, in your predator-free environment, in your socially secure situation. But your brain doesn't know that. The first few seconds of waking, your brain is still running the dawn count protocol. It's assessing threats. It's verifying social presence. It's updating your mental models of who knows what and who thinks what about whom.
This is why you often wake with anxiety, even when there's no rational reason for concern. Your brain is performing its morning threat assessment, checking social status, running simulations of possible problems. It's doing exactly what it evolved to do. The problem is that it evolved to wake up in a world where these assessments were life or death important, where the morning count could reveal that someone died during the night, where your social standing genuinely determined your survival. Now those same systems are misfiring, treating work deadlines like leopard attacks, treating social media notifications like reputation-critical gossip, treating your alarm clock like the end of a night siege that you barely survived. Every morning, you experience the most complex cognitive event in nature. You reconstruct yourself from the scattered experiences of the previous day, integrate the emotional processing of your dreams, update your model of your social network, verify your continued existence, and plan for a future that extends beyond immediate survival. You do this in seconds, automatically, barely aware it's happening. But this process, this morning ritual, is the foundation of everything that makes you human. Your sense of self, your experience of time, your understanding of others as minds like your own, your participation in culture as a collective memory system. It all traces back to that first morning, hundreds of thousands of years ago, when someone woke up and asked the question that changed everything. Is everyone here? Not just, is everyone alive, but is everyone here? Do I see who I expect to see? Do they see me? Do they know that I see them? Do they care that I survived the night? That recursive loop of mutual recognition, played out every single morning for hundreds of thousands of years, constructed the architecture of human consciousness. In the next chapter, we'll explore the final piece of this evolutionary puzzle. What happened when humans finally conquered the night completely? When we developed technology so effective at keeping the darkness at bay that we forgot why we feared it in the first place. Because that's when things got really interesting and really dangerous. When you stop respecting the night, when you flood your world with artificial light, when you disrupt the ancient rhythms that governed sleep for millions of years, something breaks. And we're living in that broken state
right now. The artificial dawn, how electric light shattered our sleep, and why darkness is dying. There is a generation alive today, barely, who remember the last natural nights. Not wilderness nights, not camping trip nights. I'm talking about everyday nights in human civilization, where darkness was still dark, where night still meant something, where your circadian rhythm wasn't constantly being hijacked by screens, streetlights, and the glow of a world that never sleeps. My grandmother, born in 1920 in rural Ukraine, described nights from her childhood that sound alien to modern ears. Darkness so complete that you literally couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Silence so profound that you could hear your own heartbeat. A sky so full of stars that the Milky Way cast shadows. She described winter nights when the family would gather around the fire after sunset, not because they wanted to, but because there was literally nothing else to do. No lights to read by, no entertainment except conversation and the stories told in firelight. She described the primal fear of walking alone at night. Not fear of crime or human threats, but something deeper, more instinctive. The fear that had nothing to do with rational assessment and everything to do with millions of years of evolution screaming warnings about the dark. That world is gone. We killed it in less than a century. And we're only beginning to understand what we lost and what it's doing to us. Let's establish the timeline, because the speed of this transformation is crucial to understanding its impact. 1879. Thomas Edison demonstrates a practical incandescent light bulb. For the first time in human history, artificial light bright enough to truly banish darkness becomes technologically feasible. 1882. Edison's Pearl Street station in New York City begins providing electrical service, the first grid-based electrical lighting system. 1920. Roughly 35% of American homes have electricity. In Europe, the number is similar. Most of the world still lives in natural darkness. 1950. Over 90% of American and European homes have electricity. Street lighting is becoming standard in urban areas. 1980. The era of 24-hour businesses begins to spread. Cities start to become genuinely always on. The concept of closing at night becomes obsolete in major metropolitan areas. 2000. The Internet age brings screen-based light sources directly into bedrooms. The final frontier of darkness, the sleeping space itself, begins to fall. 2020. The average person in a developed nation is exposed to artificial light from sunset to sunrise. True darkness has become a luxury experience, something you travel to wilderness areas to find. 2025. We are now at the point where a child born in a major city might experience true, natural darkness fewer than a dozen times in their entire life. The transformation took 146 years. For context, that's roughly 0.005% of the time humans have existed as a species. It's about 0.0001% of the time our lineage has been sleeping at night. We changed the fundamental conditions of human sleep in the blink of an evolutionary eye. To understand what this means, we need to talk about the suprachiasmatic nucleus, a cluster of roughly 20,000 neurons in your hypothalamus that serves as your brain's master clock. This clock doesn't run on time, it runs on light.
Here's how it works. Specialized photoreceptor cells in your retina, called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, detect light levels, particularly blue wavelength light. This information goes directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which uses it to synchronize your circadian rhythm to the 24-hour day-night cycle. For millions of years, this system worked perfectly. Dawn meant increasing light, signaling the brain to suppress melatonin production, raise cortisol levels, increase body temperature, prepare for waking. Dusk meant decreasing light, signaling the opposite, ramp up melatonin, lower cortisol, drop body temperature, prepare for sleep. The system is elegant, robust, and absolutely dependent on regular light-dark cycles. Now here's what we've done to it. Modern humans are exposed to artificial light averaging 100 to 300 lux in the evening, bright enough to significantly suppress melatonin production. For context, a single 60-watt incandescent bulb produces about 800 lux at 1 meter distance. A typical smartphone screen produces 200 to 400 lux. Compare this to the natural environment our circadian system evolved in. Sunset brings rapidly declining light levels, dropping from 10,000 plus lux, bright daylight, to 1 lux, moonlight, within about 30 minutes. Then it stays at 0.1 to 1 lux, starlight to moonlight, until dawn. The circadian system expects this sharp, predictable transition. Instead, we give it this: 10,000 lux during the day, if we're lucky enough to go outside, then a gradual, irregular decline to maybe 100 to 300 lux that persists until we finally turn off the lights, often just before attempting to sleep. It's like trying to conduct an orchestra where the sheet music says crescendo to forte, then sudden stop. But the musicians are instead playing a vague, wandering diminuendo that never quite ends. Let's focus on melatonin specifically, because this hormone is absolutely critical to understanding what's happening to human sleep. Melatonin isn't just a sleep aid. It's a fundamental regulatory molecule that coordinates circadian rhythms across your entire body. Every organ system, your digestive system, immune system, cardiovascular system, reproductive system, has melatonin receptors and uses melatonin signals to synchronize their activity to the day-night cycle. In a natural light environment, melatonin production begins ramping up about 2 hours before your usual sleep time. This is called dim light melatonin onset, or DLMO, and it's the most reliable marker of circadian phase. But here's the problem. Bright light exposure, particularly blue wavelength light in the 460 to 480 nanometer range, suppresses melatonin production with remarkable efficiency. A 2011 study published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism found that exposure to room light, less than 200 lux, before bedtime suppressed melatonin production by about 85% in most individuals. Let me repeat that. Regular indoor lighting, the kind you consider dim and cozy, suppresses 85% of your melatonin production. Now factor in screens, smartphones, tablets, computers, televisions. All emit significant blue light, typically in the exact wavelength range that most powerfully suppresses melatonin. A 2015 Harvard study compared reading on a light-emitting e-reader versus reading a printed book before bed. The e-reader users showed suppressed melatonin production, delayed circadian phase by 1.5 hours, reduced REM sleep, increased sleep latency, took longer to fall asleep, reported feeling less alert the next morning despite sleeping the same total duration. And most devastating, these effects persisted even after the devices were turned off. Your circadian system doesn't immediately reset when the light disappears. It takes time, often several days, to resynchronize to a normal light-dark cycle.
Here's why this matters from an evolutionary perspective. Remember Chapter 3, where we discussed how REM sleep evolved as a threat simulation system? How nightmares and dreams served as a survival mechanism? That system depends on proper circadian timing. REM sleep is not evenly distributed throughout the night. It's heavily concentrated in the final sleep cycles, particularly in the hours before natural dawn. This timing isn't accidental. It reflects the threat profile of the Pleistocene night. Predators are most active at dusk and dawn. The middle of the night is relatively safer. Both predators and prey are mostly sleeping. But the approach of dawn brings renewed danger, as predators make final hunting attempts before daylight. Your REM sleep system evolved to be most active during this pre-dawn period, running its most intensive threat simulations when threat probability was highest. But this system requires two things to function properly. 1. A clear circadian signal about when dawn is approaching. 2. Sufficient total sleep duration to reach the final REM-heavy cycles. Modern humans are failing at both. When your circadian rhythm is disrupted by irregular light exposure, your brain loses track of where you are in the night. Your REM cycles become disorganized. You might get REM sleep earlier when it's less beneficial, or miss it entirely if you wake up before the final cycles complete. And when you're chronically sleep-deprived, which most modern humans are, you never reach the final, most important REM cycles. You're cutting off precisely the part of sleep that does the most cognitive and emotional processing. Let's talk numbers, because the scope of modern sleep deprivation is genuinely staggering. According to the CDC, more than 1/3 of American adults routinely get less than 7 hours of sleep per night. Among adolescents, the numbers are even worse. Roughly 70% of high school students report insufficient sleep. But the problem isn't just duration, it's consistency. Natural human sleep, in the absence of artificial light, shows remarkable regularity. Studies of people living without electricity, modern hunter-gatherers, traditional agricultural communities, show they go to sleep roughly 2 to 3 hours after sunset and wake roughly at dawn. This timing varies with the seasons but remains extremely consistent within seasons. The total duration averages 7 to 8.5 hours per night, with slightly longer sleep in winter than summer. Critically, the timing is stable, going to bed and waking at approximately the same time every day. Modern humans show vastly more variability. Weekdays might mean 6 hours of sleep with wake up at 6 a.m. Weekends might mean 9 hours with wake up at 10 a.m. This variability, what researchers call social jet lag, is itself profoundly disruptive to circadian rhythms. You're essentially giving yourself jet lag every single week, flying from one time zone to another and back, except you never actually leave your house. The consequences of chronic circadian disruption and sleep deprivation are not subtle. Memory consolidation declines. That REM sleep we discussed in Chapter 3, the process that turns daily experiences into long-term memories, it's being systematically impaired. You're living in a state of perpetual partial amnesia. Emotional regulation breaks down. The connection between the amygdala, emotion generation, and the prefrontal cortex, emotion regulation, weakens with sleep deprivation. You become more reactive, more anxious, more prone to depression. Threat detection becomes hyperactive but inaccurate. Remember how the threat simulation system evolved to err on the side of false positives? When you're sleep deprived, this system goes into overdrive, but it also becomes less discriminating. You see threats everywhere, but you can't accurately assess which ones are real. Cognitive performance declines across virtually every domain: attention, reaction time, decision-making, creativity, problem-solving. After 17 hours without sleep, cognitive impairment is equivalent to a blood alcohol level of 0.05%. After 24 hours, it's equivalent to 0.10%, legally drunk in most jurisdictions. And this is happening chronically. You're not just pulling an occasional all-nighter. You're operating at mild to moderate cognitive impairment essentially all the time. But it's not just cognitive. The health impacts of circadian disruption are systemic and severe. Cardiovascular disease. Disrupted circadian rhythms increase risk of hypertension, heart attack, and stroke. Your cardiovascular system expects to operate in a predictable day-night cycle, with blood pressure and heart rate following regular patterns. Disrupt those patterns chronically, and you increase cardiovascular stress. Metabolic disorders. Diabetes, obesity, metabolic syndrome all show strong associations with sleep disruption and circadian misalignment. Your metabolism is timed to circadian rhythms. Insulin sensitivity peaks in the morning and declines at night. Eat late or sleep irregularly, and you're fighting against your metabolic programming. Immune dysfunction. Your immune system shows strong circadian variation. Certain immune responses are more active during the day, others at night. Chronic circadian disruption leads to weakened immune function and increased inflammation. Cancer. This is the truly frightening one. In 2007, the World Health Organization classified shift work, which involves chronic circadian disruption, as a probable carcinogen. Epidemiological studies show increased rates of breast cancer, prostate cancer, and colorectal cancer among long-term shift workers. The mechanism appears to involve melatonin suppression. Melatonin has anti-cancer properties. It suppresses tumor growth, reduces DNA damage, and regulates cell division. When you suppress melatonin chronically with light exposure at night, you're removing a fundamental cancer protection system. But this isn't just about individual choices to stay up late or stare at screens. We've fundamentally altered the night itself. Light pollution, artificial light at night that scatters into the atmosphere, has increased exponentially over the past century. Today, 80% of the world's population lives under light-polluted skies. In the United States and Europe, 99% of the population experiences light-polluted nights. The Milky Way, visible to every human who lived before about 1950, is now invisible to roughly 1/3 of humanity. For someone living in a major city, the night sky contains perhaps 50 visible stars. For our ancestors, it contained thousands. But the problem isn't just aesthetic. Light pollution means you're exposed to artificial light even when you're not intentionally using lights. Street lighting, building lighting, vehicle lights, all of this scatters into your living space. Studies using light meters in bedrooms show that even with curtains closed, many urban bedrooms maintain 1 to 10 lux throughout the night. That's 10 to 100 times brighter than the natural night environment. And remember, your circadian system is exquisitely sensitive. Even low levels of light exposure during the night can suppress melatonin and shift circadian phase. The impacts are particularly severe for children and adolescents. The adolescent brain undergoes massive reorganization, a process that's heavily dependent on sleep. During adolescence, the brain prunes unnecessary neural connections while strengthening important ones. This process happens primarily during sleep, particularly during the deep, slow-wave sleep that dominates the first half of the night. Simultaneously, adolescents experience a natural shift in circadian timing. They become biologically programmed to stay up later and wake up later. This is normal mammalian development. It happens in rats, monkeys, and humans. But modern society hasn't adapted to this biological reality. Schools start early, often 7:30 or 8 a.m. Adolescents are expected to wake at 6 or 6:30 a.m. to get ready and commute. Combined with evening light exposure from screens and social activities, this creates a perfect storm. Adolescents are biologically programmed to sleep from midnight to 9 a.m., but societally forced to wake at 6 a.m. The result? Chronic, severe sleep deprivation during the most critical period of brain development. The consequences show up in the data. Increased rates of depression, anxiety, ADHD diagnoses, academic struggles, risk-taking behavior. We're essentially running a massive, uncontrolled experiment in sleep deprivation on our children. But beyond the health metrics and the cognitive impairment, we've lost something more fundamental: our relationship with darkness itself. For millions of years, darkness was the condition that required maximum vigilance, maximum social bonding, maximum cognitive engagement. The night was when stories were told, when knowledge was transmitted, when the group came together. Darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a presence. A time when the world transformed, when different rules applied, when humans were forced to rely on each other because individual survival was impossible. Modern humans have eliminated this experience. We've turned night into a slightly dimmer version of day. We can work, shop, socialize, consume entertainment, all the activities of daytime, at any hour. We've gained flexibility and productivity, but we've lost the forced intimacy of the night, the periods of enforced rest when the brain could consolidate and process, the clear boundaries between active and rest states that governed human life for its entire evolutionary history. The economic pressure for 24-hour operations has created what researchers call the surveillance of wakefulness, the expectation that you should be accessible, responsive, productive at any hour. Email doesn't sleep, social media doesn't sleep, the global economy doesn't sleep. And increasingly, you're expected not to sleep either, or at least to sleep less, to be perpetually available. This is reflected in bizarre cultural messaging. Sleep when you're dead. You can sleep when you retire. Successful people wake at 5 a.m. We've made sleep shameful. a sign of weakness or lack of ambition. Meanwhile, we valorize sleep deprivation as a badge of honor, a demonstration of dedication and work ethic. This is evolutionary insanity. We're celebrating self-harm as virtue, and when the inevitable consequences arrive, when you can't fall asleep because your circadian rhythm is shattered, when you can't stay asleep because your sleep architecture is disrupted, when you can't wake up because you haven't completed your sleep cycles, we reach for pharmaceutical solutions. The sleep medication industry is worth tens of billions of dollars. Sleeping pills, wake-promoting drugs, melatonin supplements, CBD oils, herbal remedies, an entire industry dedicated to chemically overriding the natural sleep systems that we've broken through our behavior and environment. These medications aren't solving the problem. They're masking it. You're not fixing your circadian rhythm. You're chemically sedating yourself through its disruption. And many of these medications come with serious costs. Sedative hypnotics don't produce natural sleep architecture. They produce sedation that lacks normal REM and slow-wave sleep patterns. You're unconscious, but you're not getting the restorative sleep your brain needs. Melatonin supplements can help with circadian timing, but they're being used as a blunt instrument to override light-induced disruption rather than addressing the light exposure itself.
We're treating the symptoms while ignoring the cause.
The most extreme example of circadian disruption is shift work, jobs that require working during nighttime hours. Approximately 20% of the workforce in industrialized nations works evening or night shifts. These individuals are fighting directly against their circadian biology every day. The health consequences are severe and well documented. 40% increased risk of cardiovascular disease, 25% increased risk of diabetes, increased cancer risk, particularly breast and prostate cancer, increased rates of depression, anxiety, and cognitive decline, reduced life expectancy, averaging 5 to 10 years shorter. But society treats this as an acceptable cost of economic efficiency. Hospitals, factories, transportation systems, emergency services all require 24-hour staffing. We've created an economy that literally requires some people to destroy their health for the system to function. Here's what all of this adds up to. We are the first humans in history to live in perpetual light, to work against our circadian biology as standard practice, to treat sleep as optional rather than essential. And we're experiencing the consequences. Depression and anxiety disorders are at record highs. Sleep disorders affect 50 to 70 million Americans. Chronic diseases linked to circadian disruption, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, are epidemic. We're also seeing something that barely existed in pre-industrial societies: adolescent depression and suicide. Among modern teenagers, rates of severe depression have increased by more than 50% since 2005. Suicide rates among adolescents have increased by 70% over the same period. These trends correlate strongly with sleep disruption, particularly sleep disruption caused by evening screen use. We're not just sleep deprived. We're circadian disrupted on a civilization-wide scale. And we're only beginning to understand the full consequences.
But there's one more consequence that's harder to quantify but perhaps more profound. We're losing our cultural memory of what night means. For our ancestors, night was sacred time. Dangerous, yes, but also intimate, communal, essential. The stories told around fires weren't entertainment, they were cultural transmission, the passing of survival knowledge from generation to generation. The dreams experienced during those nights weren't random. They were the brain processing threats, rehearsing responses, integrating social information. The dawn count wasn't a chore, it was the daily verification of continued existence, the renewal of social bonds, the foundation of community. All of this is dissolving. Night is becoming meaningless, just darker daytime. Sleep is becoming abbreviated and fragmented, just a pause between productive hours. Dreams are becoming rare or forgotten, just neurological noise rather than essential processing. We're losing the entire architecture of human consciousness that was built around the night. But here's the thing. It's reversible. Unlike most evolutionary mismatches, where we can't return to ancestral conditions without abandoning modern civilization, sleep is different. Your circadian system is remarkably robust. Given the right conditions, regular light-dark cycles, consistent sleep timing, darkness at night, it will restore itself within days to weeks. The solutions aren't complicated. Reduce light exposure in the evening, particularly blue light. Increase light exposure during the day, particularly morning sunlight. Maintain consistent sleep timing, even on weekends. Create genuinely dark sleeping environments. Respect the biological need for 7 to 9 hours of sleep. These aren't radical interventions. They're simply restoring the light conditions that existed for millions of years of human evolution. But implementing them requires fighting against the entire structure of modern civilization. Work schedules, school start times, 24-hour economies, screen-based entertainment, social pressure to be always available. This is the battle we're facing. Not a battle with our biology. Our biology is trying desperately to function properly. But a battle with the civilization we've built, which has declared war on the night and on sleep itself. In the final chapter, we'll explore where this is leading. What happens when a species evolved for regular light-dark cycles, evolved for nighttime social bonding, evolved for darkness and dreams, attempts to function in perpetual light. Because we're not just sleep-deprived. We're conducting the largest neurological experiment in human history, and we're the subjects. The question is, can we survive it? The eternal vigil, living with ancient fear in the modern night. It's 3:17 a.m. You jolt awake. Your heart is pounding. Your breathing is shallow. Your muscles are tensed, ready for action. Your pupils are dilated, scanning the darkness of your bedroom for threats that your rational mind knows aren't there. But knowing and feeling are different things. You lie there, fully awake now, trying to convince yourself to go back to sleep. You tell yourself there's nothing wrong. You're safe. You're in your own home. The doors are locked. You live on the 3rd floor of a secure building in a low-crime neighborhood. Statistically, you're safer right now than at any point in human history. Your amygdala doesn't care about statistics. It's screaming at you that you're in danger, that something is wrong, that you need to stay alert, stay vigilant, because the night is when things die. You check your phone. A mistake. You know, the blue light will make it harder to fall back asleep, but you need the comfort of illumination, of connection, of knowing that the world is still there. 3:17 a.m. You have to be awake in 3 hours and 43 minutes. The anxiety about lost sleep adds to the existing anxiety about undefined threats. Now you're lying there calculating. If I fall asleep in the next 15 minutes, I can get 3.5 hours. But I probably won't fall asleep in 15 minutes because I'm too anxious, which means I'll get even less, which means tomorrow will be terrible, which makes me more anxious. Welcome to the modern manifestation of an ancient problem. Your brain is trying to keep you alive during a night siege that ended 1,000,000 years ago. This is the final chapter of our story. Not about the past, but about right now. About you, about me, about billions of humans living with neurological systems designed for a world that no longer exists. Let's start by understanding what's actually happening during those 3 a.m. wake-ups. Your sleep architecture includes natural periods of brief awakening throughout the night, typically 4 to 6 times. In healthy sleep, these awakenings last only seconds. You don't remember them. You briefly assess your environment, confirm everything is safe, and slip back into sleep immediately. This is the vestigial sentinel system we discussed in Chapter 1. Your brain is checking. Is everyone alive? Is the fire still burning? Are there predators nearby? In the Pleistocene environment, these brief checks were essential. The night was long, 12 hours or more depending on season, and threats could emerge at any time. A sleep system that maintained complete unconsciousness for 8 straight hours would have been fatal. So you evolved to wake periodically, scan for danger, then return to sleep. But here's the problem. That threat scanning system is hypersensitive, and in the modern environment, it's constantly being triggered by stimuli that mimic ancient threats. Let's catalog what wakes you up at 3 a.m. in the modern world. Ambient noise. Traffic sounds, neighbors, appliances, building systems. Your auditory cortex processes these sounds during sleep, comparing them to stored threat patterns. A car horn at 3 a.m. might be objectively louder than a leopard's approach, but it triggers the same unexpected sound in the night alarm. Light pollution. Even small amounts of light can signal your circadian system that dawn is approaching. Your brain initiates the awakening process, releasing cortisol, suppressing melatonin. But it's not dawn. It's just the street light outside your window. Too late. The cascade has started. Temperature fluctuations. Your body temperature drops during sleep, reaching its minimum around 4 to 5 a.m. If your sleeping environment is too warm or too cold, it disrupts this pattern. Your brain interprets temperature problems as a potential threat. In the Pleistocene, temperature regulation often meant the difference between survival and death. Physiological triggers. A full bladder, digestive processes, muscle tension, a slightly elevated heart rate from sleep apnea or other respiratory issues. Any deviation from baseline physiological norms gets flagged as potentially dangerous. Stress hormones. If your baseline cortisol levels are elevated due to chronic stress, you're essentially in a perpetual state of mild threat detection. Your brain is primed to wake at the slightest provocation. But the most insidious trigger isn't external. It's the anxiety about sleep itself. Here's the vicious cycle that traps millions of modern humans. Step 1. You experience a poor night of sleep for any reason. Stress, noise, schedule disruption, whatever. Step 2. The next day you're tired and anxious about sleeping poorly again. Step 3. That anxiety raises your cortisol levels in the evening when they should be dropping. Step 4. Elevated cortisol makes it harder to fall asleep and stay asleep. Step 5. You sleep poorly again, confirming your anxiety. Step 6. Repeat indefinitely. This is called psychophysiological insomnia, and it's the most common sleep disorder in modern society. You're not insomniac because something is wrong with your sleep system. You're insomniac because your sleep system is working exactly as designed, maintaining vigilance in response to perceived threats. and the perceived threat is insomnia itself. You're stuck in a loop where fear of the night creates the very sleeping problems that justify the fear. For our ancestors, the sleeping site was literally a battlefield, a defended position where vigilance meant survival. For modern humans, the bedroom has become a different kind of battlefield, a place of psychological conflict between your need for rest and your brain's insistence on vigilance. Sleep hygiene experts tell you to make your bedroom a sanctuary. Dark, quiet, cool, comfortable. Reserve the bed for sleep and sex only. No screens, no work, no worrying. This advice is sound, but it's also fighting against millions of years of evolution that says the sleeping place is where you're most vulnerable. The sleeping place requires maximum vigilance. The sleeping place is not a place to relax. Think about the contradiction. You're supposed to relax completely in the exact location where your ancestors were most tense and alert. You're supposed to lose consciousness voluntarily in the precise context that evolution has programmed as requiring maximum consciousness. It's like telling someone with a fear of heights to relax at the edge of a cliff. Sure, you're objectively safe if there's a railing and you're not going to fall. But try convincing your amygdala of that. But there's another factor that makes modern sleep uniquely difficult. You're doing it alone. For the vast majority of human evolutionary history, sleep was communal. You slept in proximity to your entire group, sometimes in direct physical contact, always within earshot, never truly alone. This wasn't just about defense against predators. It was about the psychological comfort of collective vigilance. You could genuinely rest because others were watching. The sentinel system was distributed across the group. Modern humans, particularly in Western industrialized societies, increasingly sleep alone. Solo households have increased dramatically over the past century. Even couples often sleep in separate beds or separate rooms. When you sleep alone, your brain can't distribute vigilance. You're the only sentinel. Every sound must be investigated by you. Every potential threat must be assessed by you. Your vigilance system can never fully relax because there's no backup. You're on watch, alone, all night, every night. This chronic solo vigilance has measurable effects. Sleep quality. People who sleep alone show lighter, more fragmented sleep patterns compared to those who sleep with partners. They spend less time in deep sleep and wake more frequently. Anxiety levels. Living alone correlates with higher rates of anxiety disorders and depression, even controlling for other factors. The lack of nighttime social presence appears to be a significant contributor. Mortality. This is the really striking one. People who live alone have higher all-cause mortality rates than those living with others. Even after controlling for socioeconomic factors, access to healthcare, and other variables, living alone increases mortality risk by roughly 30%. Some of this is obviously due to practical factors. If you have a medical emergency alone at night, there's no one to help. But a significant portion appears to be related to chronic stress from solo sleeping. Your body never fully disengages the stress response because your vigilance system never has backup. But sleeping with a partner creates its own problems. Studies show that couples often experience worse objective sleep quality when sharing a bed. More movements, more awakenings, temperature conflicts, snoring, different sleep schedules. Yet subjectively, most people report feeling better rested when sleeping with a partner. They feel more secure, less anxious, more satisfied with their sleep even when the objective metrics are worse. This is the vigilance system at work. The primitive parts of your brain value the security of group sleeping so highly that they're willing to accept reduced sleep quality in exchange for reduced vigilance demands. You sleep worse technically, but you stress less psychologically. In evolutionary terms, this was the right trade-off. Better to sleep lightly with backup than to sleep deeply alone and wake up dead. Remember Chapter 3, where we discussed how dreams evolved as threat simulation systems? How nightmares were essentially training scenarios for survival? That system is breaking down in the modern environment. Here's what's happening. Your REM sleep is being chronically disrupted by irregular schedules, light exposure, and sleep deprivation. But simultaneously, your brain is being flooded with abstract threats that the threat simulation system isn't designed to handle. Financial stress, social media anxiety, political polarization, climate change, global pandemics, job insecurity, existential dread about the future. These are real threats, but they're not threats that can be resolved through the kind of action your dream simulator is designed to practice. You can't run from climate change. You can't fight job insecurity with a stone tool. You can't escape pandemic anxiety by climbing a tree. So your dream system tries to translate these abstract threats into the concrete, physical threats it understands. Financial anxiety becomes dreams of falling. Social anxiety becomes dreams of being chased. Existential dread becomes dreams of apocalyptic scenarios. But the simulations don't work properly because the threats don't map correctly to the solutions your brain is trying to rehearse. You wake up from these dreams more anxious, not less, because the simulation didn't provide actionable survival strategies. The statistics on modern nightmare prevalence are genuinely alarming. 50 to 85% of adults report experiencing occasional nightmares. 5 to 10% experience nightmares weekly or more frequently. Among people with anxiety disorders, PTSD, or depression, nightmare frequency approaches 50 to 70%, having nightmares at least weekly. Compare this to studies of traditional societies with minimal light pollution and regular sleep schedules. Nightmare prevalence is dramatically lower, typically under 10% experiencing even occasional nightmares. We've created an environment that maximizes nightmare generation. Chronic stress primes the threat simulation system to run constantly. Disrupted REM sleep prevents proper processing and resolution of threat simulations. Abstract threats provide material for simulations, but no actionable solutions. Social isolation removes the morning ritual where nightmares would traditionally be shared and diffused. Media exposure provides a constant stream of threat information that feeds into the simulation system. The result? Millions of people experiencing nightly psychological torture from a system that evolved to protect them. But it gets worse. We're seeing increasing rates of actual night terrors, not nightmares, but something more primitive and disturbing. Night terrors occur during non-REM sleep, typically in the first few hours after falling asleep. They're characterized by sudden awakening in a state of absolute panic. Screaming, thrashing, heart racing, completely disoriented.
The person experiencing a night terror often doesn't remember it afterward. They wake up in the morning with no recollection of the episode, though partners and family members are typically traumatized by witnessing it. Night terrors are common in children, affecting 5 to 10% of kids, and usually resolve by adolescence.
But increasingly, adults are experiencing them. Why? The current hypothesis: chronic sleep deprivation combined with high stress levels creates conditions where the brain's arousal systems misfire during the transition between sleep stages. You're so exhausted that you fall into deep sleep very quickly, but you're also so stressed that your arousal systems are hyperactive. When your brain tries to transition between sleep stages, these conflicting signals create a neurological short circuit, a moment where you're simultaneously deeply asleep and in full panic mode. It's your vigilance system misfiring, activating full threat response in the absence of any actual threat. When confronted with this epidemic of sleep problems, modern medicine offers pharmacological solutions. Benzodiazepines, non-benzodiazepine sedatives, Z-drugs, antidepressants used off-label for sedation, over-the-counter antihistamines, melatonin, CBD, herbal supplements. The global sleep aid market is projected to exceed $100 billion by 2030. But here's what's actually happening when you take most sleep medications. You're not fixing your sleep system. You're chemically overriding it. Benzodiazepines and Z-drugs work by enhancing GABA, the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. They essentially turn down the volume on your entire nervous system, including the vigilance system. This produces unconsciousness, but it's not natural sleep. The sleep architecture is distorted. Less REM sleep, altered slow-wave sleep patterns, reduced sleep spindles, which are important for memory consolidation. You wake up feeling hungover because your brain didn't get to do the processing it needed to do. You were sedated, not rested. Moreover, these medications create tolerance and dependence. Over time, you need higher doses to achieve the same effect. And if you try to stop, you experience rebound insomnia, often worse than the original sleep problems, because your brain has down-regulated its natural sleep systems in response to the medication. You're not solving the problem. You're creating a new problem that requires ongoing medication to manage. The alternative approach is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI, which actually addresses the underlying vigilance system dysfunction. The core techniques: sleep restriction. Paradoxically, you reduce time in bed to match actual sleep time. If you're only sleeping 5 hours despite spending 8 hours in bed, you limit yourself to 5.5 hours in bed. This creates mild sleep deprivation, which makes falling asleep easier and consolidates sleep into fewer, deeper blocks. Stimulus control. You associate the bed with sleep only. If you can't sleep within 15 to 20 minutes, you get up and leave the bedroom. You return only when sleepy. This breaks the association between bed and wakefulness and anxiety. Cognitive restructuring. You identify and challenge the catastrophic thoughts about sleep. "I'll never fall asleep" becomes, "I'm having trouble falling asleep tonight, but I've fallen asleep every night of my life eventually." Relaxation training. You learn techniques to down-regulate the vigilance system. Progressive muscle relaxation, breathing exercises, meditation. The evidence shows CBTI is more effective than medication for long-term insomnia improvement, but it requires work, time, and often professional guidance. it's harder than taking a pill. And fundamentally, it's trying to use cognitive techniques to override a system that operates largely below conscious awareness. You're trying to talk your amygdala out of being vigilant. Sometimes it works, but it's fighting against millions of years of evolution. But individual solutions, whether pharmacological or behavioral, miss a crucial point. This is a cultural problem, not just an individual one. Modern culture has declared war on sleep. We've created economic systems that reward sleep deprivation, educational systems that ignore circadian biology, social systems that operate 24/7, and technological systems that intrude into every moment of rest. Fixing your individual sleep while living in this culture is like trying to eat healthy while living in a house made of candy. Sure, you can do it with sufficient willpower and discipline, but you're fighting against your entire environment. Consider the concept of social jet lag, the mismatch between your biological sleep timing and your socially imposed sleep timing. Your circadian rhythm wants you to sleep from midnight to 8 a.m. Society requires you to wake at 6 a.m. for work or school. You've just given yourself 2 hours of jet lag every single day without ever leaving your time zone. This affects roughly 70% of people in industrialized nations. Most people's natural sleep timing doesn't match their required wake times. The consequences accumulate. Chronic fatigue, increased accident rates, reduced cognitive performance, mood disorders, metabolic problems. But society treats this as your problem to solve individually. You're supposed to just try harder, to wake up earlier, to go to bed earlier, to override your biology through sheer willpower. We've medicalized a social problem, turning circadian misalignment into individual pathology, rather than recognizing it as a systems-level design failure. And then there's technology, specifically the smartphone. The average American checks their phone 96 times per day. That's once every 10 minutes during waking hours. And increasingly, those checks extend into the night. 43% of phone owners age 18 through 29 use their phone as an alarm clock, which means the phone is within arm's reach all night. 35% check their phone in the middle of the night if they wake up. The phone serves multiple functions that hijack your sleep. Social connection. You can reach out to others at any time, breaking the isolation of solo sleep. But this comes at the cost of screen light exposure and cognitive activation. Threat monitoring. You check news, social media, emails, feeding your vigilance system with information about potential threats, most of which you can't do anything about. Entertainment. You use the phone to distract from anxiety about not sleeping, which paradoxically makes sleep harder. Time checking. You obsessively check what time it is and calculate how much sleep you're losing, increasing anxiety. The phone is simultaneously a security blanket and a threat source. It's the modern equivalent of the campfire, a source of light and connection in the darkness. But unlike the campfire, it actively disrupts the very sleep it's supposed to comfort you into. For children and adolescents, the impact is even more severe. The current generation is the first in human history to grow up with screens as a primary source of evening entertainment and social connection. They're also experiencing sleep problems at unprecedented rates. 70% of high school students get insufficient sleep. 40% of adolescents report difficulty falling or staying asleep. 25% of children under 5 have a screen in their bedroom. The developing brain is particularly vulnerable to circadian disruption. The prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for impulse control, emotional regulation, and decision-making, is undergoing critical development during adolescence. This development is heavily dependent on sleep, particularly REM sleep. When you disrupt adolescent sleep, you're not just making them tired, you're interfering with fundamental brain maturation processes. The consequences show up in the statistics. Increased rates of anxiety, depression, ADHD, academic struggles, risk-taking behavior, and suicide. These correlate strongly with screen time and sleep disruption. We're conducting a massive, uncontrolled experiment on developing brains, and we're only beginning to see the results. The COVID-19 pandemic created a natural experiment in how humans respond when normal routines collapse and existential threat becomes constant. The results were striking. Nearly everyone's sleep got worse. Researchers coined the term coronasomnia to describe the epidemic of sleep problems during lockdowns. 40% increase in clinical insomnia symptoms. 25% increase in nightmare frequency. Dramatic increases in sleep medication use. Widespread reports of COVID-specific nightmares, often involving suffocation, isolation, or disease. But here's what's interesting. The sleep problems weren't primarily due to the virus itself. They were due to the conditions the pandemic created. Disrupted routines. Without regular work schedules, people's sleep timing became irregular. Social jet lag actually improved for some people who could finally sleep according to their natural rhythms, but most people experienced more chaotic schedules. Increased screen time. With in-person interaction limited, screen use exploded for work, socializing, entertainment. Evening light exposure increased dramatically. Chronic threat exposure. Constant news about death counts, hospital overwhelm, economic collapse, political dysfunction. The threat simulation system was running overtime on threats that couldn't be solved through physical action. Social isolation. For people living alone, the lack of in-person contact, particularly the loss of casual social interaction, created a sense of profound isolation that persisted into nighttime. Existential anxiety. The pandemic forced many people to confront mortality in a way they'd successfully avoided before. This triggered ancient fears about death, vulnerability, and loss of control. The pandemic essentially removed many of the modern comforts that had allowed people to ignore their broken sleep systems. When the normal distractions disappeared, people were left alone with their anxiety and their ancient vigilance systems, and they discovered that those systems were not functioning well. As the acute phase of the pandemic receded, researchers expected sleep problems to resolve. They largely haven't. Many people who developed insomnia during the pandemic still have it years later. The nightmare frequency has decreased, but remains elevated above pre-pandemic levels. Sleep medication use has stabilized at higher levels than before. This suggests that the pandemic didn't create the sleep problems, it exposed them. The underlying dysfunction was always there, masked by routines and distractions. The pandemic just stripped away the coping mechanisms, revealing the fragility
of modern human sleep. All of this brings us back to you, lying awake at 3 a.m. You understand now that you're not broken. Your sleep problems aren't evidence of weakness or personal failure. You're experiencing the entirely predictable consequence of placing a Pleistocene vigilance system in a modern environment. Your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do, scanning for threats during the vulnerable period of sleep. The problem is that it's scanning for leopards in a world of abstract anxieties, checking for hyenas in a world of email notifications, counting group members in a world of social isolation. You're not insomniac. You're a time traveler, carrying a 3 million-year-old survival system through a world that changed completely in the last century. But understanding this doesn't immediately solve the problem. You still have to wake up in 3 hours and 43 minutes, now 3 hours and 27 minutes, and face a day that demands full cognitive function despite inadequate sleep.
So what do? First, recognize that you're fighting a war on two fronts, against your ancient biology and against your modern environment. You need strategies for both. For your biology, respect your circadian rhythm. Give it clear, consistent signals. Morning light exposure, evening darkness, regular sleep timing. These aren't suggestions, they're requirements for proper function. Work with your vigilance system, not against it. If you wake at 3 a.m. and can't fall back asleep within 15 minutes, get up. Leave the bedroom. Do something quiet and calming in dim light. Return to bed only when sleepy. This prevents the bed from becoming associated with anxious wakefulness. Practice lowering your physiological arousal before sleep, not because you're too tense, but because your arousal system is calibrated for threats that no longer exist. Progressive muscle relaxation, breathing techniques, meditation. These aren't New Age nonsense. They're tools for manually overriding a hyperactive vigilance system. Except that perfect sleep is not the goal. You're not trying to sleep like your ancestors did. That's impossible in the modern world. You're trying to sleep well enough to function, which is a lower but achievable bar. For your environment, reduce evening light exposure, particularly blue light. This isn't optional if you want functioning circadian rhythms. Use blue-blocking glasses. Install amber bulbs. Set your screens to night mode. Create an artificial dusk even if the sun sets at 9 p.m. or not at all. Address light pollution in your bedroom. Blackout curtains, eye masks. Make your sleeping space as dark as possible. Your circadian system doesn't distinguish between streetlights and dawn. Consider the sound environment. White noise, earplugs, whatever helps minimize the startle response to unexpected sounds. Your vigilance system will wake you for novel sounds. Reducing novelty helps. Think carefully about solo versus partnered sleep.
If you're sleeping alone and struggling, the ancient solution was group sleeping. Maybe that means a pet. Maybe that means a roommate. Maybe that means addressing why you're living solo if it's not by choice. This sounds trivial, but the vigilance system responds powerfully to social presence. But individual solutions are insufficient. We need cultural change. We need to stop valorizing sleep deprivation. The "I only need 4 hours of sleep" bragging needs to be recognized as pathological, not admirable. It's not discipline. It's self-harm. We need work schedules that accommodate human biology. Flexible start times, reduced schedules for adolescents, protection for shift workers, recognition that not everyone has the same optimal work hours. We need to redesign education around circadian biology. School start times that match adolescent sleep phases. Reduced homework that doesn't extend into late evening. Education about sleep as a core life skill, not an afterthought. We need technology designed with sleep in mind. Devices that automatically reduce stimulation in evening hours. Social media platforms that don't use infinite scroll and algorithmic rage to keep you engaged past midnight. Apps that genuinely help sleep rather than just tracking it. We need urban planning that respects darkness. Light pollution regulations. Dark sky preserves. Recognition that the night sky isn't just aesthetic. It's a fundamental part of the environment humans evolved in. We need healthcare systems that prioritize behavioral sleep interventions over pharmaceutical ones. CBTI should be first-line treatment, easily accessible, covered by insurance. None of this is happening at scale. We're moving in the opposite direction. More screens, more 24/7 operations, more light pollution, more glorification of sleeplessness. And so we return to 3:17 a.m. You, lying awake, heart pounding, scanning for threats that don't exist while ignoring the threats that do.
You're experiencing the cost of being human in the modern world. You're carrying 3 million years of successful survival programming through an environment that's changed completely in 3 generations. Your vigilance system kept your ancestors alive. It allowed them to survive nights when leopards circled the trees, when hyenas waited for exhaustion to cause fatal mistakes, when the fire died and darkness became absolute. That system is still active, still scanning, still vigilant, still convinced that the darkness holds death. But here's the truth that no amount of understanding can fully override. It's not entirely wrong. The darkness does hold death, eventually. The threats are real, they're just different. The vulnerability of sleep remains. You're still unconscious, defenseless, at the mercy of circumstances beyond your control. Your ancient vigilance system is responding to a truth that modern life tries to deny. You are fragile. You are mortal. You are always, ultimately, alone in your consciousness. The 3 million years of nighttime terror that shaped your brain weren't just about external predators. They were about the fundamental vulnerability of existence itself. The knowledge that every night might be your last. The awareness that consciousness can end. We invented electric lights, locks, alarm systems, surveillance, pharmaceuticals, a technological fortress against the night. But we can't lock out mortality. We can't illuminate away the fundamental truth that every period of unconsciousness is a small death, and every awakening is a resurrection. Your vigilance system knows this. That's why it won't let you rest, and perhaps in some deep way that's appropriate. Perhaps the cost of consciousness is eternal vigilance. Perhaps the price of being the species that conquered the night is never truly being able to rest. So lie there at 3:17 a.m., heart pounding, aware of the darkness, aware of your vulnerability, aware of the ancient fear that made you human. You're not broken. You're awake in every sense of the word. And in the morning, because there always is a morning, you'll rise, count the living, share your nightmares, and prepare to face another day. Just as your ancestors did, just as your descendants will. The vigil continues. 3:17 a.m. becomes 4:15 a.m., becomes 5:30 a.m. Eventually, you'll sleep again. Not well, not deeply, but enough.
The vigilance system will finally accept that no immediate threat exists and allow you a few more precious hours of rest. And when you wake, groggy, exhausted, dreading the day ahead, you'll engage in a ritual older than language itself. You'll count the living, even if it's just you, even if there's no one to count but yourself. You'll verify, I survived another night. I still exist. I continue. This is the dawn count, still echoing 3 million years later. And perhaps that's the only resolution this story has. Recognition. Not solution, not victory, just awareness of what you're carrying. You carry the fear of the darkness, the memory of the trees, the scars of a million nights when everything in the world was trying to kill you. You carry the dreams, the nightmares, the threat simulations that kept your ancestors alive through conditions that would have destroyed any other primate. You carry the dawn ritual, the morning count, the fundamental human need to verify that you and yours survived the night. You carry consciousness itself, that peculiar, torturous gift that emerged from millions of years of vigilance, of scanning the darkness, of running simulations of danger. And you carry it forward, one impossible night at a time, in a world that demands you function as if none of this history matters. But it does matter. Every sleepless night is a reminder that you're descended from the most anxious, vigilant, paranoid primates who ever lived.
The ones who saw threats that weren't there often enough that they occasionally caught threats that were. The ones who sacrificed rest for vigilance and survived because of it. You are the descendant of insomniacs, of worriers, of the fearful. And that's exactly why you're here. So when 3 a.m. comes again, and it will come again, maybe instead of fighting the wakefulness, instead of desperately seeking the sleep that won't come, you can acknowledge what's actually happening. Your vigilant system is working. Your ancestors are speaking through your neurons. The night terror that shaped humanity is still shaping you. You're not broken. You're human. And being human means carrying the darkness with you, even into the artificial light. The vigil is eternal. But so is the dawn.